The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of town like freight. That was the only word for it. The driver didn't offer his hand, didn't tip his hat. He pulled her trunk from the back, set it in the dirt with a thud that sent up a cloud of yellow dust, and climbed back into his seat without a word. The horses shifted, leather creaked, and then the coach rattled forward, leaving Clara Bennett standing alone at the end of a road she didn't know, in a town she had never seen, holding a letter that was already starting to feel like a lie. Red Hollow, Oklahoma Territory, 1882. She'd imagined it differently. Not grand, she wasn't a fool, but alive. Something with a pulse, and instead what she saw was a stretch of warped wooden buildings lining a single unpaved street, a water trough green with algae, and a general store with a crooked sign that read Harmon and Sons, in letters that had given up pretending to be straight. A handful of horses stood tethered in front of a saloon. A woman in a gray bonnet swept the steps of a boarding house and did not look up. Clara looked down at the letter in her hand. The paper was soft from being handled too many times. The ink faded at the creases where she'd folded and unfolded it during the long trip. She'd read it so often she could recite it by heart. Dear Miss Bennett, I write in response to your listing in the Western Matrimonial Gazette. She folded it again, tucked it into the pocket of her dress. She was 26 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed more than most men thought a woman should weigh, and she knew that because most men had made sure to tell her so. Her dress was brown cotton, travel-stained, and damp under the arms from 4 days on a stagecoach through August heat. Her boots were scuffed. Her hair, dark and thick, had come loose from its pins on the last leg of the journey, and she hadn't had a mirror to fix it. She picked up one end of the trunk. It scraped along the ground as she dragged it toward the center of town, because there was nobody to help, and she had learned a long time ago not to wait for someone to offer. The sun was brutal, not the polite warmth of a summer afternoon, but a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders and scalp, drying the sweat on her neck before it had time to cool her. The air smelled like horse manure and hot wood and something vaguely metallic, like iron left out in the heat. Her mouth was dry, her feet hurt. She had been traveling for 4 days from Illinois, changing coaches twice, sleeping upright with her head against a window frame, eating stale bread and cheese she'd packed in a cloth bag that was now empty. The letter had promised a meeting at the livery stable at noon. She found the livery by following the smell of hay and manure to a large, open-fronted building near the end of the main street. A boy of maybe 14 was shoveling something unpleasant from a stall. He glanced up when she approached, took in the sight of her, the size of her, the sweat on her face, the trunk dragging behind her, and looked away quickly. "Excuse me," Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. 4 days of dust will do that. "I'm looking for a Mr. Thomas Avery. I was told he'd be here at noon." The boy leaned on his shovel. "Avery? He was here earlier, left about an hour ago." "An hour ago. Did he say where he was going?" "Didn't say nothing to me, ma'am." Clara stood there for a moment, the sun hammering down on the top of her head. She could feel the first flicker of panic, a cold thread running through the heat, but she pressed it down. People were late. Coaches arrived at unpredictable times. Plans shifted. It didn't mean anything. "Is there a place I might wait? Out of the sun?" The boy pointed with his chin toward a bench along the side of the building, shaded by a narrow overhang. Clara dragged her trunk over and sat down. The bench groaned under her. She was used to that sound. She waited. The first hour was uncomfortable. The second was worse. By the third hour, she had drunk the last warm mouthful of water from her canteen and was starting to do the arithmetic of her situation in a way that made her stomach tighten. She had 37 cents. Her return ticket had been one way, because she couldn't afford otherwise, and because the whole point of coming here was that she wasn't going back. She had no friends in this territory, no family west of the Mississippi. Her father was dead. Her mother had remarried a man who made it very clear that Clara was not part of the new arrangement. Her sister Adeline had written 2 letters in the past 3 years, both short, both ending with the same polite lie. "I do hope you'll visit when things settle down." Things never settled down. That was the joke. She had placed her listing in the Western Matrimonial Gazette 6 months ago, after her position at the textile mill in Decatur was eliminated when the mill cut half its workforce. She had written it carefully, honestly, because she had learned from experience that dishonesty only delayed humiliation. Respectable woman of good health and practical skills seeks correspondence with gentlemen of sincere intentions. Age 26, of sturdy constitution, experienced in cooking, sewing, livestock management, and household organization. No fortune but a willing disposition and a strong back. Sturdy constitution. She'd agonized over that phrase. It was the closest she could come to honesty without writing the words that would have guaranteed no responses at all. I am a large woman, and I am tired of apologizing for it. 3 men had responded to her listing. Thomas Avery was the one whose letter she'd carried across 400 miles of prairie. He'd sounded kind, educated even. His penmanship was neat, his sentences well-constructed, and he'd mentioned a small farm outside of Red Hollow and a desire for companionship that seemed genuine. I am not a young man, he had written, nor a wealthy one, but I am steady, and I believe that a marriage built on mutual respect may prove more durable than one built on fleeting sentiment. Mutual respect. She had liked that. She had carried those words with her like a talisman. Now she was sitting on a bench outside a livery stable in a town she didn't know, and Thomas Avery had not come. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps on the wooden boardwalk, and then a voice, thin and apologetic, saying, "Miss Bennet?" Clara stood up. Her dress was wrinkled. Her hair was a disaster. She could feel the dried salt of old sweat on her upper lip, but she stood straight and looked the man in the eye and said, "Mr. Avery, I'm pleased to finally meet you." Thomas Avery was shorter than she'd expected, thin, with a narrow face and wire-rimmed spectacles that sat crookedly on his nose. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she appreciated, and his boots were polished, which she noticed. He looked like a man who had prepared for this meeting. He also looked like a man who was seeing something different from what he'd prepared for. She watched it happen. The moment his eyes moved from her face to her body, the slight backward lean, almost imperceptible, like a man stepping away from a fire that was hotter than expected. The tightening around his mouth, the way his hands moved to his sides and then into his pockets, and then out again, finding no comfortable position. "Miss Bennet," he said again, and this time the apology in his voice wasn't about being late. "You're a bit different than I expected." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "In what way, Mr. Avery?" He took off his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on, all of this to avoid looking at her. "Well," he said, "your listing mentioned a sturdy constitution." "It did. I suppose I imagined something different." "You imagined someone thinner." The directness startled him. She could see it in the way his shoulders pulled up, the quick blink behind the wire frames. People didn't expect bluntness from women, especially not from women who were supposed to be grateful for any attention at all. "Miss Bennet, he exhaled. "I'm sure you're a fine woman, capable, good-hearted, but I have to be honest with you. I don't think this arrangement would suit. I have a small property, as I mentioned, and the work is demanding, and I need someone who can..." "Who can what, Mr. Avery?" "Someone with more vigor." Clara looked at him. She had carried 40-pound flour sacks at the mill for 3 years. She had wrung laundry by hand every week since she was 11. She had walked 6 miles to and from work every day in Decatur because she couldn't afford the trolley. She had more vigor in her left arm than this bony, spectacle-wearing man had in his entire body. But she didn't say that. "I understand," she said, because she did. She understood perfectly. She had understood since she was 12 years old, and her aunt had pulled her aside at a family dinner and said, "Clara, sweetness, you might want to push back from the table a bit earlier. Men don't want a wife they can't get their arms around." Thomas Avery shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience of your journey. I should have been more specific in my correspondence." "Yes?" Clara said. "You should have." He left quickly after that, with the hurried steps of a man escaping something uncomfortable. Clara watched him go. Then she sat back down on the bench because her knees were shaking and she needed a moment before she could think clearly. All right. One refusal. She could handle one refusal. There had been 3 men who responded to her listing, and Thomas Avery was only the first name on the list. The second, a Mr. Harold Pruitt, lived in the area as well. She had his letter somewhere in the trunk. She found it after 10 minutes of digging through her belongings, crouched on the ground beside the bench, pulling out folded clothes and a hairbrush and a Bible she'd been given by the church back in Decatur, and a tin box of sewing needles. Harold Pruitt's letter was shorter than Avery's, the handwriting blockier, but the tone was friendly enough. He'd mentioned cattle and a house with 4 rooms. She asked the livery boy if he knew a Harold Pruitt. "Charlotte," the boy said. "He's in town today. Probably at the saloon." Clara smoothed her dress, retied her hair as best she could with the pins she had left, picked up her trunk, and walked to the saloon. She did not go inside. A woman did not walk into a saloon in Red Hollow, Oklahoma territory in 1882 and expect anything good to happen. Instead, she asked a man leaning against the hitching post outside if he would be kind enough to fetch Mr. Pruitt. The man looked at her trunk, looked at her body, grinned in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pruitt? You here for Pruitt?" "I am." "Well now." The grin widened. "That's something." He disappeared through the swinging doors. Clara heard laughter inside, short, sharp, the kind that came at someone's expense. A minute later, Harold Pruitt emerged. He was bigger than Avery, broader, red-faced, with thick hands and a mustache that needed trimming. He smelled like beer and tobacco and something sour underneath. He stood on the boardwalk and looked down at Clara, and his expression went through the same transformation she had seen on Thomas Avery's face, only faster and less polite. "You're the woman from the listing?" "I am. Clara Bennett." "Jesus Christ." She flinched. He rubbed his mustache with the back of his hand. "Look, no offense, ma'am, but you're not what I had in mind." "Mr. Pruitt, not what I had in mind at all." He was already backing toward the saloon doors. "I'm looking for a wife, not a... I mean..." He waved a hand vaguely at her body, as if the gesture would finish the sentence he didn't want to complete. "Not a what, Mr. Pruitt?" But he was already gone, the swinging doors flapping behind him. Through the gap, she heard his voice, raised for the benefit of his audience. "Boys, you should see what the mail order sent me." Laughter, loud, mean, rolling out through the doors like smoke. Clara picked up her trunk. Her hands were trembling. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry, because crying on the main street of a strange town was the one thing she absolutely could not afford to do. 2 down, there was a 3rd man. She didn't even have a proper letter from him. Just a note, really, scrawled on the back of a feed store receipt, forwarded to her by the Gazette. A man named Virgil Combs. He hadn't written much, just that he had property and needed a wife and wasn't particular about appearances. She'd held on to that phrase the way a drowning person holds onto a piece of driftwood. She found Virgil Combs in front of the general store. The livery boy pointed him out. A wiry man in dusty clothes sitting on an overturned barrel, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that was too big for the job. He had a narrow face, deep-set eyes, and the kind of stillness that might mean calm or might mean something else entirely. "Mr. Combs?" He looked up. The knife paused. "My name is Clara Bennett. I believe you responded to my listing in the Western Matrimonial Gazette." He studied her, not with the quick, disgusted assessment of the other 2, but slowly, the way a man looked at a horse he was thinking about buying. His eyes moved from her face to her shoulders to her hips and back again, and there was a calculation in that look that made her stomach turn. "Yeah," he said. "I remember. I've traveled from Illinois. I arrived today." "I can see that." He went back to whittling. A long curl of wood fell from the blade and landed in the dust. "Thing is," he said, not looking up, "I found someone else last month. Younger girl. From Missouri." Clara stood very still. "So you don't need..." "Nope." He blew wood shavings off the blade. "Sorry about the trip." He didn't sound sorry. He didn't sound like anything at all. Clara stood there on the boardwalk of Red Hollow's main street, with her trunk at her feet and 37 cents in her pocket, and absolutely nowhere to go. The sun was dropping toward the horizon now, painting the sky a deep orange that would have been beautiful if she'd been in any condition to notice it. Behind her, the saloon was getting louder as the evening crowd arrived. She could still hear Harold Pruitt's voice carrying through the doors, and she was fairly certain she heard her name. A small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk across the street. Not deliberately. People in small towns didn't need to deliberately gather. They just appeared, drawn by the quiet magnetism of someone else's misfortune. A woman in a blue dress. 2 older men sharing a bench. A girl of about 8, watching with the unselfconscious curiosity of childhood. They were watching her. She knew that. She knew what they saw, too. A fat woman from back east who had come all this way expecting a husband and had been turned down by 3 men in a single afternoon. A joke. A cautionary tale. That's what happens when you aim above your station. That's what happens when you forget what you look like. Clara sat down on her trunk. The latch dug into the backs of her thighs. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the ground between her boots. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. She was stranded. She had no money for a ticket home, no home to go back to even if she could afford the ticket, and no reason to believe that a single person in this town cared whether she slept in a bed tonight or on the ground behind the livery stable. She had gambled everything on a letter from a stranger, and she had lost. The light was changing. Shadows stretched long across the street, turning the dust from gold to gray. The heat was easing, but the air still felt thick, pressing against her chest like a hand. She became aware of footsteps, not the casual footsteps of someone passing by, but deliberate, purposeful steps coming toward her. She looked up. A man was crossing the street, tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that looked like it had been assembled in a hurry. Strong jaw, slightly crooked nose, deep lines around the mouth that came from squinting into the sun or from not smiling for a long time. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that were brown from the sun and scarred in a few places. His boots were caked with dried mud. He carried his hat in one hand, which was unusual. Men in this territory wore their hats like armor. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. "You're Miss Bennett?" His voice was low, a little rough, like he didn't use it often enough to keep it smooth. "I am. I'm Elias Mercer. I have a ranch about 8 miles north, Mercer Ridge." Clara waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for, but she'd learned that silence sometimes drew out truth faster than questions. Elias Mercer looked at her. Not the way the other 3 had looked at her. Not with disgust or calculation or the nervous embarrassment of a man trying to escape. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they've been turning over in their mind for a while and have finally decided to act on. "I heard what happened today," he said, "with Avery and Pruitt and Combs. The whole town heard, I expect. Most of it." A pause. "I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for other men." "No, but someone should." He turned his hat over in his hands. It was a worn hat, the brim shaped by years of handling, the band stained with sweat. He seemed to be gathering himself the way a man does before he lifts something heavy. "I have 2 children," he said. "A girl, Rose. She's 7. A boy, Caleb. He's 12. Their mother died 3 years ago, and I've been managing since then, but managing isn't enough. The house is falling apart. The children need more than I know how to give them. Rose hasn't had a woman's voice in her life since she was 4, and Caleb—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that Clara couldn't quite read. "Caleb is angry, and I don't blame him for it, but I don't know how to fix it." Clara said nothing. "I'm not offering romance," Elias said. "I want to be straight with you about that. I'm offering a roof, meals, and a partnership. The ranch is hard work, cattle, fences, the garden, the house, all of it. I can't pay hired help anymore, and I can't keep asking neighbors to check on the children when I'm out working the land. I need someone in that house. Someone steady. You need a housekeeper. I need a wife." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Not in the way you're probably thinking," he added quickly. "A legal arrangement. Your name on the ranch alongside mine. My children would be in your care and you would have a home. That's the deal." Clara studied him. He wasn't handsome, not in the way the dime novels described handsome. His face had too many hard angles, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that went deeper than one sleepless night. But he was looking at her directly, which was more than anyone else in this town had managed, and his voice, for all its roughness, held no mockery. "Why me?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered, and she watched his face carefully when she asked it. Elias didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Because you're here," he said. "Because you came 400 miles on a promise and got treated like dirt, and you're still sitting upright. Because I know what it feels like to have no good options and have to choose anyway. That's not a reason to marry someone. It's the most honest reason I've got." She looked down at the letter still in her pocket. Thomas Avery's neat handwriting. Mutual respect. She thought about Harold Pruitt's laughter rolling through the saloon doors. She thought about Virgil Combs, whittling without looking up, telling her he'd found someone younger. She thought about 37 cents and no ticket home. "Your children," she said. "They don't know me." "No. They might not want me there." "Probably not. Rose will come around faster than Caleb. Caleb doesn't trust Easy." "And you? Do you trust Easy?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something old and bruised. "I don't trust at all, Miss Bennett, but I'm too tired to do this alone anymore." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't kind. It wasn't the answer she would have written in a letter or told a friend about with a smile. But it was honest, and after 400 miles of riding toward a lie, honesty felt like the only currency worth anything. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. Judge Parker does marriages at the courthouse in town." "Tomorrow!" She almost laughed. "You don't waste time." "Can't afford to." He put his hat back on. "I've got a wagon around the back of the general store. If you want, I'll take you to the ranch tonight. The children are with a neighbor, Mrs. Harlan. There's a spare room. It's not much, but it's got a bed and a door that locks." "A door that locks?" "I figured you'd want to know that." She did want to know that. The fact that he'd thought to say it, without being asked, without making it into something gallant or self-congratulatory, told her more about Elias Mercer than any letter could have. Clara stood up from the trunk. Her legs ached. Her back was stiff. The dust on her dress had turned to a fine layer of grime, and she could feel the sunburn tightening across the bridge of her nose. She was not a picture of bridal hope. She was a tired, sweating, sun-scorched woman standing in a failing town at the edge of the known world, agreeing to marry a stranger because the alternative was sleeping in the dirt. "All right," she said. "Let's go." He picked up her trunk, lifted it like it weighed nothing, which it nearly did. She'd packed light because she didn't own much. He carried it across the street toward the general store, and Clara followed, and she could feel the eyes of Red Hollow on her back the entire way. The woman in the blue dress, the two old men on the bench, the little girl who had been watching with such open curiosity. Harold Pruitt, standing in the doorway of the saloon with a beer in his hand, his mouth open in an expression that might have been surprise or amusement. Let them watch. Let them add this chapter to the story they were already telling about the fat woman from Illinois who couldn't land a husband. Let them shake their heads and cluck their tongues and say, "Poor Elias, taking on that woman because nobody else would." Clara didn't look back. She had spent her whole life looking back, at mirrors, at the faces of people who found her lacking, at the closed doors of opportunities that shrank the moment she walked into a room. She was done looking back. The wagon was old, the wooden bed scarred and splintered, the wheels caked with mud from some recent crossing. Two draft horses stood in the traces, flicking their tails at flies. Elias set her trunk in the back and offered his hand to help her up to the seat. She took it. His hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who worked with it every day. He didn't squeeze too hard or hold on too long. He just helped her up and then climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. 8 miles, he said. Road gets rough about halfway. I can handle rough road. He glanced at her. Just a quick look, almost involuntary, and then he faced forward and snapped the reins, and the horses lurched into motion. They drove out of Red Hollow as the sun touched the horizon. The sky was bleeding orange and pink, and the prairie stretched out on both sides like an ocean made of grass, rolling and shifting in the evening wind. Somewhere out there, coyotes were beginning to call, short, sharp yips that bounced across the open land. Clara didn't speak for the first 2 miles. Neither did Elias. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people who had run out of small talk before they'd started and were both too tired to pretend otherwise. Finally, Clara said, "Tell me about Rose." Elias kept his eyes on the road. "She's small for her age, quiet, likes to draw. She'll fill up any piece of paper she can find. Flowers mostly, sometimes horses." A pause. "She still asks about her mother." "What do you tell her?" "That her mother loved her very much, that she got sick and couldn't stay." "Is that true?" "The first part is, her mother loved those children more than anything in this world. The sickness—" He stopped. His jaw tightened, and Clara could see the muscle working beneath the skin. It was consumption, took about a year. By the end, she weighed less than Rose does now. Clara absorbed that. "And Caleb?" Caleb is harder. The reins shifted in his hands. He was 9 when she died. Old enough to understand, young enough to think that understanding means the same thing as handling it. He doesn't talk about her, not to me anyway. He does his chores, keeps to himself, and looks at me sometimes like he's waiting for me to explain something I don't have words for. He's angry. Yeah. At you? Elias was quiet for a long time. The horses clopped steadily along the rutted road, and the sky darkened from orange to deep purple. Probably, he said. I wasn't there when she died. I was out fixing a fence line. By the time Mrs. Harlan came to get me, it was over. Caleb was in the room. He was holding her hand. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not pity. She'd been on the receiving end of pity too many times to mistake it for something useful, something closer to recognition. The feeling of hearing a pain she understood, even if the details were different. You couldn't have known. No, but he was 9, and he was alone with his dying mother, and I was fixing a fence. Try explaining that to a 12-year-old. She didn't try. Some things didn't have explanations, and pretending otherwise was just another kind of lie. The road got rougher, just as he'd warned. The wagon jolted and creaked over ruts and stones, and Clara braced herself with one hand on the seat and the other on the rail. The darkness was settling in now, thick and complete, and the stars were coming out. More stars than she had ever seen in Illinois, so many they looked like spilled salt across black cloth. There, Elias said, pointing. Clara squinted into the darkness and saw, at the top of a long rise, the outline of a house against the sky. It was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories, with a porch running along the front and a chimney rising from one end. Behind it, she could make out the shapes of outbuildings. A barn, maybe, and what looked like a chicken coop. Fences stretched away in both directions, marking off land that she couldn't see but could sense. The way you sense the size of a room in the dark. Mercer Ridge, Elias said. He said it without pride, without the false modesty of a man who wants you to be impressed, but doesn't want to seem like he's asking. He said it the way you'd say the name of a place you'd fought for so long that the fighting had used up all the feelings you'd originally had about it. The wagon pulled up in front of the porch. A lamp was burning in one of the downstairs windows. Mrs. Harlan probably, keeping things together until Elias got back. Clara could hear chickens muttering from the coop and, somewhere in the darkness, the low sound of cattle. Elias jumped down and came around to her side. He offered his hand again, and again she took it, climbing down carefully in the darkness. Her boots hit packed earth. She stood there looking at the house. Her house, if tomorrow went as planned. Her porch. Her chimney. Her children sleeping upstairs in rooms she'd never seen. The front door opened and a woman appeared, 60-ish, gray-haired, sturdy, with a face that suggested she had opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them. She held a kerosene lamp that threw wavering light across the porch. Elias. She looked past him to Clara. Her eyes moved quickly, assessing, and Clara braced for the familiar reaction, the judgment, the polite surprise, the recalibration of expectations. But Mrs. Harlan just nodded. You must be the young lady. Come inside. I made soup. Clara almost cried then. Not from the kindness specifically, though it was kind, but from the simple, uncomplicated normalcy of it. Come inside. I made soup. As if Clara were an expected guest and not a desperate stranger and not a punchline. She followed Mrs. Harlan into the house. The front room was large, cluttered, and needed cleaning. Dishes in a basin by the stove. A child's drawing tacked to the wall with a bent nail. A pair of small boots by the door, arranged neatly, and a pair of larger boots beside them, arranged not at all. The furniture was plain. A table, chairs, a rocker by the fireplace. But solid. The kind of furniture a man builds when he has more skill than money. Children are asleep, Mrs. Harlan said, ladling soup into a bowl. Rose went down easy. Caleb pretended to read for an hour and then gave up. Thank you, Margaret, Elias said. Mrs. Harlan set the bowl in front of Clara. Eat, she said. It wasn't a suggestion. Clara ate. The soup was thin, mostly broth with some potato and a few strands of chicken, but it was hot and salted, and it was the first real food she'd had in 2 days. She ate all of it, and when Mrs. Harlan refilled the bowl without being asked, Clara ate all of that too. Elias sat at the other end of the table watching her. Not staring, just watching, the way a man watches weather coming in from the west, trying to read what it means. "I'll show you the room," he said when she finished. He led her upstairs. The hallway was narrow, the floorboards creaking under their weight. He stopped at a door near the end of the hall. This was... He paused. "It was a guest room. Hasn't been used in a while. I put fresh sheets on this morning." He opened the door. The room was small. A bed, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a window with a faded curtain, a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. The sheets were white, slightly wrinkled, and smelled like soap and cedar. "The door locks," he said, pointing to the bolt, "from the inside. You mentioned that. I wanted you to see it." They stood there in the narrow doorway, and the awkwardness of the situation settled over them like a blanket. Two strangers standing 3 feet apart in the upstairs hallway of a house where they were going to pretend to be a family starting tomorrow. "Thank you," Clara said, "for the room, and for all of it." Elias nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "Miss Bennett." "Yes?" "Those men today, Avery and Pruitt and the rest." He kept his eyes on the wall behind her, and she could see how much it cost him to say what came next. He was not a man who talked easily. "They're fools. You ought to know that. Whatever they saw when they looked at you, that's their failing, not yours." He walked down the hall before she could respond. She heard his boots on the stairs, then the creak of a chair as he settled somewhere below, and then silence. Clara closed the door. She slid the bolt. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against the mattress. It was lumpy. The springs squeaked. She started to cry, not the pretty, gentle kind of crying that women did in books, the kind where a single tear traced a graceful line down a porcelain cheek. This was the ugly kind, the shaking, gasping, snot running down your face kind, the kind that came from a place so deep inside that you didn't know it was there until it broke open. She cried for the 400-mile journey and the stagecoach dust and the 3 men who had looked at her body and decided it canceled out everything else. She cried for her mother, who hadn't fought hard enough to keep her, and for her sister, who had stopped trying. She cried for all the years of being the biggest person in the room and knowing, always, immediately, before a single word was spoken, that everyone had noticed. She cried for Elias Mercer, who had proposed to her in a dusty street not because he wanted her, but because he was too tired to do it alone. And for his children who were asleep down the hall and didn't know yet that a stranger was going to sit at their breakfast table tomorrow and try to be something she had no experience being. She cried until her chest hurt and her eyes were swollen and the pillow was damp under her cheek. And then she stopped, because crying, like everything else in her life, was something she did thoroughly and then put away. She washed her face in the basin. The water was cool and slightly metallic, drawn from a well. She unpinned her hair and let it fall around her shoulders, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Same face. Round cheeks, dark eyes, a scattering of freckles across a nose that was slightly too wide. She didn't look like a bride. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a tired woman who had been crying, which was exactly what she was. "All right, Clara," she said to the mirror. "You're here. That's something." She lay down on the bed. The springs complained. The moonlight came through the thin curtain and painted a silver rectangle on the floor. Somewhere in the house, a child coughed. Once, softly, and then was still. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the silence of a house that didn't know her yet. A ranch that hadn't tested her yet. A family that hadn't decided yet whether to let her in or push her out. Tomorrow she would marry a man she'd met 2 hours ago. Tomorrow she would meet 2 children who had lost their mother and gained a stranger in her place. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Not the work of the ranch, though that would be hard enough, but the work of proving that she was more than the body everyone saw first. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she did, she didn't dream of Illinois. The morning came in gray and quiet, the way mornings do when the world hasn't decided yet what kind of day it's going to be. Clara was awake before the light. She lay on her back staring at the ceiling of the small room, listening to the house around her. The tick of settling wood, the distant low of cattle somewhere past the barn, the particular silence of a place that held sleeping children. Her eyes were swollen from the night before. Her back ached from the stagecoach and then the wagon, and then the lumpy mattress that had managed to be both too soft and too hard at the same time. She'd slept maybe 3 hours, maybe 4. It didn't matter. She'd worked on less. She got up, washed her face in the basin, which had gone cold overnight, pinned her hair back with the pin she had left. She'd lost two somewhere between Illinois and Oklahoma and hadn't replaced them because she'd been saving every cent for the journey. Put on her second dress, the dark green one, which was less wrinkled than the brown one she'd arrived in, laced her boots, straightened the bed. Then she stood in the middle of the small room and thought about what came next. What came next was walking downstairs into a kitchen she didn't know, in a house that wasn't hers, to face two children who didn't want her there and a man who had married her out of exhaustion. What came next was figuring out, in real time, how to exist in a space that hadn't made room for her. She'd done harder things. She reminded herself of that. She opened the door and went downstairs. The kitchen was cold. The stove had gone out overnight, and nobody had lit it yet. Pale gray light came through the window above the wash basin, catching the dust on the glass. The table from the night before had been cleared, the soup pot sitting in the basin. There was a basket of eggs on the counter, which meant someone had already been to the chicken coop, and next to it, a half-empty sack of flour. Clara found the kindling box beside the stove, found the matches on a hook above it, and started a fire. She had the stove going and was looking through the pantry, methodically, without touching anything she wasn't sure about, taking inventory, when she heard the stairs creak. One small footstep, then another, then nothing, which meant the child had stopped. Clara didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the pantry shelf, eyes on a row of preserves that needed checking. She said, "Good morning," to the wall. Silence. Then very quietly, "How did you know I was there?" Clara turned around then. Rose was standing at the bottom of the stairs in a cotton nightgown, bare feet on the cold floorboards, dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was small. Elias had said small for her age, and he'd been right. Her face was round and serious, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, dark and watchful. She was holding the end of her braid in one hand, which she'd been pulling down over one shoulder while she stood there, the way children fidget when they're trying to look like they're not nervous. "The stairs creak differently under a small person's weight than a big one's," Clara said. "Middle stair especially." Rose considered this. "I was trying to be quiet." "You were quiet. I just noticed anyway." Clara paused. "I'm Clara." "I know." A beat. "Papa told us last night, after we were supposed to be asleep." "Were you listening from the stairs?" "Caleb was. I was at the top." Clara almost smiled. Was Caleb satisfied with what he heard? "No," Rose said plainly. "He said you were probably like Mrs. Pritchard." "Who's Mrs. Pritchard?" "The school teacher. She has a voice like a wagon wheel that needs greasing, and she raps knuckles with a ruler." Rose paused, then added, with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old, "You don't look like Mrs. Pritchard." "I'll take that as a compliment." It was one. Rose's eyes moved to the stove, where the fire was now burning steadily. "You lit the stove." "I did." "Papa always does that." "Your papa isn't down yet." Rose seemed to weigh this, as if checking it against some internal rule book about what was allowed and what wasn't. Then she padded across the cold floor to the table and climbed into a chair, tucking her feet under her. "Can you make oatmeal?" she asked. "I can." "Caleb doesn't like oatmeal, but Papa says he has to eat it anyway." "What do you like?" Rose thought about this with a seriousness that suggested the question deserved careful consideration. "Oatmeal is all right. I like it with the brown sugar. Papa usually forgets the brown sugar." "I won't forget," Clara said. She found the oats and the brown sugar. She found a pot and a ladle. She found, after some searching, where the salt was kept. Her hands moved through the kitchen with the practical efficiency of a woman who had cooked in other people's kitchens before, adapting to unfamiliar layouts, learning where things lived by the logic of the space rather than memory. Rose watched her the whole time, not with hostility, just the careful watching of a child trying to figure out what something was. Elias came down at 6:30. He was dressed, had clearly been up for a while. There was already mud on his boots, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara at the stove and Rose at the table, and the expression on his face was complicated enough that Clara couldn't read it. It might have been relief. It might have been something more uncomfortable than that. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Clara said. "There's oatmeal in about 10 minutes. I already fed the horses." I know, I heard you. He came in and poured himself water from the pitcher, and Rose immediately said, She remembered the brown sugar, Papa, with the tone of someone reporting important news. Elias looked at Clara again. Did she? Apparently you often forget. Rose tells everyone that. It's true, Rose said without guilt. Caleb came down at 10 minutes to 7. Clara heard him on the stairs, heavier than Rose, deliberate, the footsteps of a boy who was making sure you heard him coming so you couldn't accuse him of sneaking. He came around the corner of the hallway and stopped when he saw her, and his face did the thing 12-year-old faces do when they're trying to look indifferent and aren't quite managing it. He was tall for his age, dark-haired like his father, with his mother's mouth. She could tell that from the picture on the mantel, the small oval photograph she'd glimpsed the night before. He was not a bad-looking boy. He was a boy who looked like he was carrying a weight that had been placed on him too young and hadn't been lifted since. Caleb, Elias said, this is Miss Clara. I know who she is, Caleb said. Not rudely exactly, just flatly, the way you'd state a fact that didn't need discussion. Good morning, Clara said. Caleb looked at the stove, at the pot, at the table where his sister was already eating. He pulled out the chair across from Rose and sat down, and Clara set a bowl in front of him without asking, because waiting for him to ask would have meant waiting a long time. He looked at the bowl, then at her. I don't like oatmeal. Your father mentioned that. Then why? Because it was what I knew how to make with what's in the pantry. When I know what else you have and where it is, I'll make something different. She met his eyes calmly. But for today, it's oatmeal. I put brown sugar on it. A pause. He looked at the bowl again, picked up the spoon. He ate it. He didn't say thank you, but he ate it, and he didn't leave the table, and that Clara decided was about as good as she could expect on the first morning. The wedding happened that afternoon. Judge Parker was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the weary efficiency of someone who had performed too many ceremonies to attach much ceremony to them. He had them stand before his desk in his small courthouse office, read the appropriate words from a worn leather book, asked them both to confirm their willingness, and was done in 7 minutes. Mrs. Harlan served as witness. Rose had wanted to come and had been permitted, which meant she stood solemnly at Clara's elbow in a dress with a ribbon that kept coming undone, gripping the hem of her own skirt with both hands. Caleb had not wanted to come. Elias hadn't forced him. Clara understood that too. There was no ring. Elias had not thought to get one, or hadn't had the money, and Clara hadn't expected one. There was no celebration afterward. No cake, no dancing, no well-wishers throwing seeds or flower petals. Mrs. Harlan hugged Clara briefly and firmly, the kind of hug that communicated more than words would have. And then they drove back to the ranch in the same wagon, with Rose sitting between them on the seat and talking about a bird she'd seen that morning with unusual markings. And Clara thought, this is what it is then. This is what we are. She could live with that. What she had not accounted for was how hard everything else would be. Not the physical work. She had been prepared for the physical work, had expected it, had welcomed it even, because hard labor had always been the one place where no one could argue with her. When Clara worked, she worked with her whole body, and the results were visible and undeniable, and nobody could look at a clean floor or a mended fence line or a properly put-up batch of preserves and say it wasn't good enough. The physical work of Mercer Ridge Ranch was brutal, but it was knowable. It had a beginning and an end. You could measure what you'd done at the close of the day, and if the measurement was good, you could sleep. It was everything else that wore at her. The first week, she learned the layout of the house by necessity, where the dry rot was in the back porch steps that had to be avoided or repaired, where the roof leaked when the rain came in from the northwest, where the pantry mice had been getting in through a gap behind the flour bin. She learned that Rose liked to be read to before bed and would pretend to be asleep if you skipped the reading. She learned that Caleb did his chores without being asked, but did them with the minimum possible interaction with anyone else, retreating to the barn or the south fence line whenever the opportunity presented itself. She learned that Elias woke at 4:30 without an alarm, was gone to the cattle before she came down, and came back for meals with dirt on his hands and a tiredness in his eyes that he managed with a quietness that was either stoic or depressed, depending on the day. She learned that Martha Mercer, Elias's first wife, Rose, and Caleb's mother, had been small. There were signs of her everywhere in the house, if you knew how to read them. The hooks on the wall were all mounted low, at the height of a woman who was 5'2" at most. The garden layout, dormant now, but clearly once very organized, had the meticulous planning of someone who had thought carefully about what would grow where. The curtains in the front room were a faded blue with a small embroidered border along the hem, the kind of detail that required patience and a particular kind of care. Clara didn't move any of it. It wasn't her house in that sense. It was Martha's house, and she was living in it, and that was a distinction she needed to keep straight in her own mind before she could do anything useful. What she did do was clean, not a pointed, aggressive cleaning that suggested the house had been wrong before. Just a thorough, systematic working through of rooms and corners and surfaces that had been neglected by a man with too much else to do and children too young to fill the gap. She beat dust out of rugs. She scrubbed the stove until the iron showed through properly. She sorted through the pantry and identified what was still good and what needed to go, and made a list of what needed to be purchased in town, which she presented to Elias without editorializing. He looked at the list. That's a lot. Most of it can wait, she said. The baking soda and the salt can't. He looked at the list again, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket. I'll get to town Thursday. I can go? The wagon's needed Thursday for the feed. I can walk. He looked at her, and she could tell he was weighing whether she meant it or whether she was making a point. She meant it. She'd walked 6 miles to work every day for 3 years. It's 4 miles, he said. I know. Both ways. That makes 8 miles, which is also something I know. He almost said something else. She could see the beginning of it in his face, the impulse to argue, or possibly the impulse to say you don't have to, which would have been its own kind of insult. But he swallowed it and nodded. Take the list then, he said. She walked to town on Thursday. It was a hot morning, the dust rising off the road under her boots, the sun already fierce by 8 o'clock. She carried a basket and the list and 30 cents of the household money Elias had given her, and she made the purchases efficiently and without lingering because she was aware, acutely aware, that she was a known quantity in Red Hollow now. The woman Elias Mercer had picked up out of the street when nobody else wanted her. The large woman from back east who had somehow ended up at Mercer Ridge. People noticed her in the store. She felt them noticing the way you feel a temperature change, a slight adjustment in the room, eyes moving and then moving away. The shopkeeper's wife, a small woman named Mrs. Aldrin, was pleasant enough in a careful way that told Clara she'd already been discussed. You're settling in at the Mercer place, then? Mrs. Aldrin said while she counted out the baking soda. I am. Those children need a mother. They surely do. She paused. Elias has had a hard run of it. Most people have had hard runs of it, Clara said, not unkindly. That's not really what makes someone interesting. Mrs. Aldrin blinked. Then, after a moment, she said, No, I suppose not. Clara paid for her goods and walked home. 8 miles in the August heat with a basket and a slightly sore left heel where her boot was wearing thin. She got back to the ranch at 11:30, put everything away, and had lunch on the table by noon. Nobody said anything about the walk. The real problem with Caleb started in the second week. It wasn't one large thing. It was a dozen small ones, the kind of friction that builds up the way sediment builds up in a water pipe, invisible until the flow stops entirely. He answered her questions with as few words as possible. When she asked him to do something, pass the salt, carry wood, let her know when the water barrel needed filling, he did it eventually, but with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. He wasn't defiant. He was distant, in the way that is sometimes more exhausting than defiance, because there was nothing to push against. He also talked to his father about her. Not to her, and not in front of her, but she could hear them sometimes in the evenings, when she was in the kitchen and they were on the porch. She couldn't make out words, only tone. Caleb's voice with a tight, controlled edge to it, and Elias's voice lower, slower, saying things that didn't seem to satisfy. One evening, towards the end of the second week, Caleb came into the kitchen while Clara was mending a tear in one of his shirts. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. That's my shirt, he said. I know. The seam along the left shoulder had come open. If I don't fix it now, the whole side will go. I didn't ask you to do that. Clara set down the needle and looked at him directly. No, you didn't. He waited as if expecting a longer response, an apology, or a defense, or an explanation. When none came, he said, My mother used to do the mending. I know. Then you know that's... He stopped, his jaw tightened. That's not your place. The words hung in the air between them. Clara looked at him steadily, at this 12-year-old boy with his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and a grief that had been sitting on his chest for 3 years with no good place to go. Caleb, she said carefully, I'm not trying to take your mother's place. I couldn't, even if I wanted to, and I don't want to. That's not what I'm here for. She picked up the shirt again. I'm mending the shirt because it needed mending. That's all. Then you should have left it for him to take to Mrs. Harlan. That's what we've always done. Your shirts have been going to Mrs. Harlan for 3 years, Clara said. That's 3 years of her time, spent on mending that can be done here. She tied off the thread, snipped it, and held the shirt out to him. Here, it's done. You don't have to thank me. He took the shirt. He looked at the mended seam. She had done it neatly, the stitches small and even, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite acknowledgement, but was at least not contempt. He left without speaking, but he took the shirt. She counted that as something. By the end of the 3rd week, Clara had settled into a rhythm of sorts. The days had a shape now. Early morning kitchen work, the morning chores while Elias and sometimes Caleb worked the cattle and the fences, midday meal, afternoon work in the garden or the house, or wherever the day's particular need pointed. Rose had started following her, at first at a careful distance and then, gradually, closer, appearing at her elbow while she kneaded bread, asking questions with the relentless specificity of a child who wanted to understand exactly how things worked. Why do you press it like that? To work the gluten. It makes the bread hold together. What's gluten? A kind of protein. It's what makes the bread chewy instead of crumbly. What's protein? Rose. Clara pressed the dough firmly. Let me teach you one thing at a time. Rose perched on the edge of the table and watched, serious and attentive. She had a quality of focused attention that Clara found remarkable in someone her age. When Rose decided to pay attention to something, she paid attention with her whole self, the way very young children do before the world teaches them to divide their concentration. Can I try? Rose asked. Clara shifted to make room. Come here. Rose climbed down and stood beside her, and Clara guided her small hands through the pressing motion, and for a while the kitchen was filled with the smell of yeast and the sound of dough being worked and nothing else. It was the first moment, Clara would think later, when the house felt even slightly like something she belonged to. What she hadn't expected was the neighbors. She'd known, in an abstract way, that a new wife arriving at Mercer Ridge would attract attention. Small communities ran on information about each other. It was how they maintained cohesion and staved off the isolation of frontier life. Someone new was always an event, and someone new who had arrived under unusual circumstances was a more interesting event than most. What she hadn't accounted for was the variety of that attention. Mrs. Harlan was straightforwardly kind. She came by twice in the first 2 weeks, bearing food and quiet conversation and none of the carefully worded questions that Clara was learning to identify as social audits. She was the kind of woman who had seen enough of life to have given up judging its less tidy arrangements. The Dempsey family, who farmed the quarter section to the east, were politely watchful. Tom Dempsey came by to talk cattle with Elias and spent the whole conversation with one eye in Clara's direction, as if trying to solve a puzzle. His wife, Nancy, came separately, 3 days later, with a covered dish and a face arranged in the expression of a woman who is visiting but also measuring. She stayed 40 minutes. She was not unfriendly. She was not quite friendly. She's trying to figure out how to feel about you, Elias said that evening when Clara mentioned it. I noticed. People around here liked Martha. He said it simply, without apology, the way you state a geographic fact. She was from this territory. They knew her family. She fit. And I don't fit. He was quiet for a moment. They were on the porch, the end of the day, the sky turning the colors it turned out here every evening, the kinds of colors that Clara had not been prepared for, coming from Illinois, where the horizons were interrupted by trees and hills and buildings. Here, the sky was the whole show. You're not what people expected, he said. Nobody ever is, to the people who expected something else. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a flicker of something, here and gone. That's true, he said. They sat in silence for a while after that. Not the charged silence of two strangers who had accidentally found something in common, but the plain silence of two tired people sitting at the end of a long day with nothing urgent left to say. That was what she had not anticipated either. Not the comfort of it. She wasn't naive enough to call it comfortable. But the absence of the constant low-level anxiety she'd carried her entire life in the presence of other people. The anticipation of judgment, of the look, of the careful recalibration of someone's expectations when they finally saw her in person. With Elias, that had already happened. He had seen her and chosen her anyway, for his own reasons, and whatever judgment he'd made had been made and set aside. There was a strange freedom in that. She didn't know what to call it yet. The harder moments came without warning, the way the harder moments always do. A Saturday in late September, clear and bright. Clara had gone to the garden to harvest the last of the summer squash before the first frost came, which she could smell in the morning air now, cold and mineral and imminent. She was working along a row of squash with a basket, the sun on her back, her hands moving through the leaves. She heard voices from the direction of the road. Two women on horseback, coming at an easy walk. She recognized one of them, a woman named Ida Bright, who she'd seen briefly at the general store, young, pretty, in the way that some women are pretty without appearing to try for it, with a loud laugh and a manner of talking that made everything sound like either gossip or entertainment. The other woman she didn't know. They pulled up at the fence line. Clara straightened and shaded her eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." Ida Bright looked at her from horseback with an expression that was technically polite and entirely assessing. "You're the new Mrs. Mercer." "I am." "I heard Elias finally took a wife." Ida's eyes moved from Clara's face to her body and back again with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knew how to look without appearing to look. We all wondered when he would. "Now you know." The other woman, younger, was trying not to stare and failing. Ida said, "This is my sister Dottie. She's visiting from Enid." "Hello, Dottie." Dottie managed to smile. "Hello, Mrs. Mercer." "We were just passing," Ida said, though the road didn't go anywhere past the ranch that was worth passing to. "Thought we might say hello. How are you finding it out here?" "I find it fine," Clara said. "It's lonely, though, isn't it? The ranch." Ida tilted her head slightly. "Especially for someone not from here. I imagine you miss... Where was it? Illinois? Illinois. I imagine you miss home." "I don't have much to miss," Clara said. She was watching Ida carefully, the way you watch a hand of cards someone is about to play. "It's a long ways from here, which is useful." Something moved across Ida's face. Not quite respect, but the preliminary gesture toward it, the acknowledgement that the person opposite you was paying attention. She adjusted her reins. "Well, you're welcome at the church social next Saturday. Elias never comes, but you might like it." "I might," Clara said. "Thank you for stopping." They rode on. Clara watched them go, and then she picked up her basket and went back to the squash. And she thought about Ida Bright and her sister from Enid, and the way some women use politeness the way a carpenter uses a level, not to measure friendliness, but to measure how far from true someone else is standing. She did not feel defeated by it. She felt clear-eyed, which was almost better. She had been clear-eyed about her situation her whole life, clear-eyed about what she was and was not, about what would and wouldn't be handed to her, about the distance between how she was seen and who she actually was. The difference now was that she had a roof and a stove and a garden, and two children who were at least beginning to acknowledge her presence, and a husband who didn't say much but said what he meant when he spoke. She had survived the first weeks. The ranch hadn't beaten her. The neighbors hadn't beaten her. The loneliness hadn't beaten her because she had a high tolerance for loneliness, having spent most of her life cultivating it by necessity. What she hadn't anticipated was that she would start to care. It happened the way most things happened, without announcement, through small accumulations. Rose's hand finding hers in the dark one evening when the wind came up hard and rattled the windows, and the small girl had padded into the kitchen and stood there without a word, just needing someone nearby. Caleb, who one afternoon when she was struggling with a stuck gate hinge, appeared without being asked and held the gate while she worked the pin free, and then disappeared again without comment, as if he'd simply been passing by in that exact direction at that exact moment. Elias, coming in from a difficult day, she could tell from the way he moved, the set of his jaw, and sitting down to the meal she'd made and eating it without complaint, and saying afterward quietly, "That was good." in a tone that wasn't trying to be complimentary so much as simply honest. She started to care about the ranch itself, about the cattle, whose names she learned from Caleb during one of their rare neutral exchanges about which animals were which, about the garden, which she spent 2 hard days clearing and preparing for next spring's planting, laying in compost and turning the soil until her arms ached, about the south fence line, which she could see from the kitchen window was sagging in 2 places and would need attention before winter. She mentioned the fence to Elias one evening. He looked out the window at the place she was pointing. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it. If you show me how to set a post, I can do the south section while you handle the east." He looked at her. "You ever set a fence post?" "No, but I expect you can explain it." A longer pause, then, "It's heavy work." "So is everything out here?" He almost said something about her being a woman. She could see it in the way his mouth moved and then stopped, and she appreciated that he stopped it. "Saturday," he said. "I'll show you Saturday." He showed her Saturday. They spent most of the day on the south fence line. He showed her how to dig the post hole to the right depth and diameter, how to set the post plumb, how to tamp the fill dirt tight to hold it. It was heavy, grinding work, the kind that left her hands raw and her back sending signals she'd have to reckon with the next morning. But she learned it, and she did it. And when they drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, she looked at the fence line and thought, with a satisfaction that was almost physical, "That's mine. I made that." Elias, sitting beside her on the wagon, said, "You're going to feel that in your shoulders tomorrow." "I know." "Should have worn gloves." "I didn't have gloves." He nodded, as if filing this information away. 2 days later, a pair of leather work gloves appeared on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything about them. Neither did she. She put them on the hook by the back door where she could find them. It was in the 4th week that she overheard what she overheard. She hadn't been listening for it. She had come around the side of the barn to check on the water trough and had stopped when she heard Caleb's voice, tight and careful, coming from inside. "She's not my mother." A pause. "She'll never be my mother." Elias's voice lower. "Nobody said she was." "Then why is she here? Why does she act like the sound of something being set down hard? A bucket, maybe. Why does she do all that? The cooking and the fixing and the... Why does she pretend to care?" Silence. Clara stood very still against the barn wall, the rough wood pressing into her shoulder. Elias said, "What makes you think she's pretending?" "Because nobody chooses this." His voice cracked on the last word, and he must have hated that because when he continued it was lower, more controlled. "Nobody just shows up and decides to love us. Mama had to. You had to. She doesn't have to, so why would she? What's she getting out of it?" A long pause. "Caleb, she's going to leave. They always leave." Another silence, and then quieter, so quiet Clara almost missed it. "Or they die. That's the same thing." She pressed her hand flat against the barn wall. She felt the roughness of the wood under her palm. She felt the heat of the day and the dust in the air and the specific physical ache of standing very still when every instinct said to move. She didn't hear what Elias said next because she made herself step quietly away from the barn wall and walk back to the house, because the conversation she'd overheard was not hers to have, and she needed a moment before she could be useful to anyone. She stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at nothing. She's going to leave. They always leave, or they die. That's the same thing. 12 years old, sitting in a room with his dying mother's hand in his own, waiting for his father to come back from a fence line. 3 years of working out a theory of the world that said, the people you need most are the ones who go away. Better not to need them. Better to stay small and careful and separate, and when the next person came along, be ready for her to leave too. Clara understood that. She understood it in her body, the way you understand things that happened to you before you had language for them. Her mother's soft pull-away, her sister's polite, careful letters. The mill, laying her off with the others, after 3 years of showing up early and staying late and lifting the things that the thinner women couldn't lift. The 3 men in the street of Red Hollow looking at her and deciding she wasn't enough. People did leave, or they did die, which was the same. Caleb Mercer was 12 years old, and he already knew that. And the terrible thing was that he wasn't wrong. What he didn't know, what Clara didn't know how to show him yet, was that some people were too tired of leaving to start. She was still at the kitchen table when she heard him come in. He went through the kitchen without speaking, and he didn't look at her, and she didn't try to stop him. But as he was going through the door, she said without looking up from the table, "Caleb?" He stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. A long pause. She still wasn't looking at him. "You can't know that," he said. "No," she said. "I can't." Another silence. Then the sound of his footsteps going up the stairs. She listened to them until she couldn't hear them anymore. She sat there for a while longer. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it came through every afternoon at this time, laying a long rectangle of gold across the floor. Outside, she could hear Rose in the yard talking to herself, the way Rose did when she was drawing something in the dirt with a stick. The ordinary afternoon sounds of a household that was, in its awkward and imperfect and grief-stubborn way, still standing, still working, still making its way through the day. Clara got up, went to the counter, started peeling potatoes for dinner. She peeled them steadily, one after another, the skins curling off in long strips. Her hands moved without thinking, the knife finding its angle automatically. The pile of peeled potatoes grew in the bowl. Outside, Rose laughed at something. Something in her own private game that required no audience. This was what it was. Not the story of a woman chosen for her beauty or her status or any of the conventional reasons one person was supposed to choose another. A cold-eyed transaction that was slowly becoming something more complicated than a transaction. A family that was carrying wounds it hadn't finished bleeding from yet. A ranch that needed more than one person could give it. 2 children learning to recalibrate everything they built to protect themselves. And Clara, at the center of all of it, peeling potatoes and trying to figure out what staying looked like when the whole world you'd grown up in had trained you to be surprised when anyone stayed at all. She filled the pot, set it on the stove, added salt. Through the window, the prairie stretched out to the horizon, gold and brown and vast, the long grasses moving in the late afternoon wind. Somewhere out there, Elias was on the land that had taken everything from him and was still, stubbornly, his. Working it because stopping meant admitting that the cost had been too high. She understood that too. The water began to heat. The potatoes shifted in the pot. Rose came through the back door trailing dust, her hands muddy, saying, "Something smells good. Is that dinner? Can I help? There was a grasshopper as big as my hand." "Wash your hands," Clara said, "and you can stir." Rose washed her hands at the basin imperfectly and quickly, and came to stand beside her. Clara handed her the long wooden spoon. "Stir slowly," she said. "You don't want to break them up." Rose stirred. Her tongue came out the side of her mouth in concentration. Clara stood next to her and let her stir, and watched the light change on the prairie outside the window, and waited for the rest of the family to come in from the long day. October came in like a warning. The first frost arrived 2 weeks earlier than the almanac had suggested, coating the garden in a thin white film that turned the last of the surviving plants to dark mush by mid-morning. Clara had gotten most of the root vegetables in before it hit. She'd smelled it coming the evening before, that particular sharpness in the air that she'd learned to read over the past 2 months. But she lost the remaining squash and a row of late carrots she'd been nursing along. She stood at the garden fence looking at the damage with her hands on her hips, calculating what was in the cellar and what would need to be purchased before the roads turned difficult. The nights were cold now, genuinely cold, the kind that crept under doors and through window gaps and settled into the floor so that the first step out of bed each morning was a small act of willpower. She had found extra quilts in the cedar chest at the top of the stairs, thick, heavy ones, patchwork, clearly made by careful hands, and she had put them on the children's beds without comment. Rose had burrowed under hers immediately and declared it the best quilt in the territory. Caleb had said nothing, but he'd kept it. The fence posts she and Elias had set in September were holding. She walked the south line once a week to check them, a habit she'd developed without deciding to, and on the 3rd week she found the second post from the east end had shifted slightly, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough that she packed dirt around its base on her own and reported it to Elias at dinner. He looked up from his plate. "Which post?" "Second from the east. I tamped it. Should hold through winter, but you'll want to reset it in spring." He nodded. "I'll mark it." Caleb was looking at her from across the table. Not with hostility. That had shifted, gradually, into something closer to watchful assessment. He was still cautious, still careful, still kept himself at a distance that she respected because pushing against it had never been her strategy. But he was watching her differently than he'd watched her in September, like he was revising something. She didn't make much of it. She'd learned that making much of small changes with Caleb was the fastest way to reverse them. What she hadn't anticipated was the sickness. It started in the valley below Red Hollow in the middle of October, which was how these things always started, Seth. Somewhere else first, close enough to worry about, but not close enough to feel real. Tom Dempsey came by one afternoon to warn Elias. 2 families on the far side of the creek had children down with fever. Bad fever, the kind that didn't break in a day or two. One family had already lost a young boy. The doctor in town was stretched thin and getting thinner. "Keep your children close," Tom said, standing in the yard with his horse. "And if anyone goes feverish, get word to me quick. Margaret Harlan's got some nursing knowledge." "I know what to do for a fever," Clara said from the porch steps. Tom looked at her. He was a decent man, Tom Dempsey. She'd come to that conclusion over the past 2 months. But he had the habit, common among men of his generation and territory, of addressing the man of the house about matters that affected the whole household. "My mother was a practical nurse," she added. "Not formal training, but she knew fevers." Tom glanced at Elias, who said nothing, and then back at Clara. "Good then," he said. "Let's hope it doesn't come to it." It came to it. Rose woke up wrong on a Thursday morning in late October. Clara knew it before the child spoke a word. She came downstairs with a quality of movement that was different from her usual morning energy. Slower, heavier, her eyes glassy and too bright at the same time. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her cheek against the wood surface, and Clara crossed the room and pressed her hand to the girl's forehead. Hot. Not warm from sleep hot. Sick hot, the kind that sits deep and stays. "How do you feel?" Clara asked. "My head hurts," Rose said, her voice muffled against the table. "And my throat." "Does it hurt to swallow?" "A little." Elias was in the doorway. He'd been coming in from the barn when Clara stopped him with a look, and now he was very still, watching his daughter's face against the kitchen table with an expression Clara hadn't seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it. Terror, quiet, controlled, but terror nonetheless, the specific terror of a man who had watched someone he loved die of sickness, and now stood in a kitchen watching his daughter's 2 bright eyes. "Go get the water heated," Clara said to him, not unkindly but firmly. She needed him moving, because a still Elias in this moment would be no use to anyone. "Hot, not boiling, and bring me the small basin from the washstand upstairs." He moved. That was the thing about Elias. Give him something to do, and he did it. The difficulty was always the waiting. She got Rose onto the settee in the front room, wrapped in the heavy patchwork quilt, and took her temperature the way her mother had taught her, pressing the back of her wrist to the child's forehead, throat, and chest in turn, learning the body's geography of heat. High, but not catastrophically so. Not yet. "What is it?" Elias said when he came back with the basin, his voice carefully neutral, which meant he was frightened. "Fever. Could be several things." She didn't say the word they were both thinking, the word that had been traveling the valley along with this illness. "We treat it the same way regardless. Keep her cool. Keep fluids in her. Watch for it to climb. The doctor is occupied with worse cases right now." She met his eyes steadily. "If she worsens, we send Caleb for him. But right now, I can manage this." She wasn't certain she could. She was honest with herself about that, in the part of her mind that wasn't performing competence for Elias. Her mother's practical nursing had been exactly that, practical, not medical. She knew how to break a fever with cool water and willow bark, knew how to get fluid into a sick child who didn't want to swallow, knew how to keep a patient comfortable and watch through a bad night. Whether that would be enough depended on what the fever was, and she wouldn't know what it was until it told her. She told Caleb that morning. He'd come down to an unusual household, no breakfast on the table, his sister not at her place. And she'd met him in the kitchen and explained simply, Rose had a fever. She was in the front room. He needed to stay away from her for now, eat what he could find in the pantry, and check in with her every few hours. He looked past her at the closed door of the front room. "How bad?" he asked. "Not terrible yet. I intend to keep it that way." He looked at her. The assessment in his eyes was different from his usual watchfulness, stripped down, urgency removing the careful distance he normally maintained. What do you need me to do? She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected the directness of it, or the steadiness. He was 12 years old, and he was frightened, and he was asking her what she needed. Keep the stove going, she said. Water heated at all times. And if she asks for you, if she specifically asks, you can sit with her briefly, but wash your hands first and don't touch her face. He nodded. All right. Caleb. She waited until he was looking at her. She's going to be fine. He held her gaze. You can't know that. It was the same thing he'd said to her weeks ago in this same kitchen, about something entirely different. She heard the echo of it, and she thought she saw him hear it too. No, she said, but I'm going to work like I do. The first day was manageable. Rose ran hot but stable, drifting in and out of the shallow, uneasy sleep of a sick child. 15 minutes of sleep, then awake and restless, then sleep again. Clara sat with her through most of it, cooling the cloth in the basin, pressing it to her forehead and wrists and the back of her neck, making sure she drank small sips of water at regular intervals. Rose was a good patient in the way that tired children often are, too exhausted to argue, willing to be cared for, occasionally asking questions in a drowsy voice that showed her mind was still working. Why does cold water help a hot head? She asked at one point, her eyes at half-mast. Your body is fighting something, Clara said, wringing the cloth. The heat is the fighting. We help it from outside by keeping you from getting too hot. What is it fighting? Something small and invisible that got into you. Like a spy? A little like a spy. Rose considered this. Tell my body to win, she said, and then her eyes closed. Elias checked in every hour. He would appear in the doorway, look at his daughter, look at Clara, and Clara would give him a small nod, still steady, and he would disappear again. He was keeping himself occupied with ranch work, she knew, because the alternative was sitting in this room, watching his daughter's face and making himself useless with fear. On the second day, the fever climbed. It happened in the early afternoon, quietly, without drama. Clara had her hand on Rose's forehead and felt the change. A degree, maybe two, the heat now pressing back against her palm in a way it hadn't the day before. Rose was more restless, her sleep broken more often now, and when she was awake she was confused in the small, circular way of high fever, asking where her mother was. The first time she asked, Clara said gently, She's not here, sweetheart. It's me, Clara. The second time, Rose said, I know, but where is she? Clara pressed the cool cloth to the girl's neck. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm here. She sent Caleb to get Elias. He came in from the field and she told him plainly, without softening it, the fever had gone up. She needed him to ride to Mrs. Harlan's and get the willow bark she knew Margaret kept. She also needed him to check whether the doctor had any better availability. He looked at Rose, who was asleep again, flushed and small, under the patchwork quilt. Is she... He couldn't finish it. She's not in danger right now, Clara said, but I want to stay ahead of it, not behind it. He rode. He was back within the hour with the willow bark, and the news that the doctor was at the Grantham farm, 3 miles north, with a child who was in considerably worse condition. He would come when he could. Margaret Harlan sent her regards and said Clara was doing exactly the right things and to send word if anything changed. That night was the first real fight. Clara had sent Caleb to bed at 9 and Elias at 10 over his protests. I need you rested in case tonight goes long, she said. You're no help to her running on nothing. He'd argued for several minutes, and she'd said it again, quieter, and finally he'd gone. She sat alone with Rose through the deep part of the night. The fever climbed further, an hour past midnight. Rose was fully awake now, but disoriented, her eyes moving around the room without fixing on anything. She was sweating heavily, which was in some ways a good sign, the body doing its work, but she was burning, her skin hot enough to be painful. I'm cold, Rose said. Why am I cold? I feel cold. I know it feels cold, Clara said. Your body is confused. You're actually hot. That's why the cool cloth helps. I don't want the cloth. I know. Clara pressed it to her forehead anyway, gently, and Rose didn't fight it, just whimpered a little and turned her head. Tell me something, Rose said. Tell me a story. Clara thought for a moment. What kind? The kind where everything gets okay. She told her a story. Not a polished one. Not the kind you'd read from a book. A made-up story about a girl who lived on the edge of a prairie, who found a small wounded fox and nursed it back to health over one long winter, and how the fox remembered her all its life and came back to her yard every autumn when the frost first hit, and how the girl grew old and the fox grew old too, and they were both still there at the end of the last winter, sitting in the last sun. It was a simple story. It didn't have much of a plot, but Rose's eyes stayed on her face the whole time, and somewhere in the middle of it they softened, and by the end her breathing had eased. Around 2 a.m, without any drama at all, Elias appeared in the doorway. He hadn't changed for sleep. He was still in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't actually gone to bed. "You should be sleeping," Clara said. "I tried." He came in and sat in the chair on the other side of the settee, not touching Rose, just there. "Let me take a shift." "I'm all right." "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it, and she noticed it, though she didn't show it. "Let me help." She handed him the basin, showed him how often to change the cloth and how cool to keep the water. He took the instruction without comment and applied himself to it with the same focused attention he brought to every practical task. And for a while they sat on opposite sides of the settee, working in silence, and the night moved around them. At 3 a.m, Rose woke up and said clearly, "Papa?" "I'm here," he said immediately. "And Clara?" "Here too," Clara said. Rose's eyes moved between them. Then she said, "Okay," and closed her eyes again. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The fever broke just before 5 a.m. Clara felt it happen, the heat beneath the cloth shifting, easing, the quality of the sweat changing. Rose's breathing slowed and steadied into the deeper rhythm of real sleep, not the shallow, fitful sleep of fever. The flush on her cheeks was still there but losing its intensity, cooling by degrees the way a hot pan cools on a stone counter. Clara pressed the back of her wrist to the girl's forehead one more time. Then she sat back in her chair and pressed both hands over her eyes. Behind her, Elias exhaled, a long, slow exhalation, the kind that carries 3 years of something in it. "It broke?" he said. "Yes." A long pause. "What do I—" His voice was rough. He stopped and started again. "What should I do?" "Let her sleep," Clara said. She took her hands from her eyes and looked at him across the settee. He looked terrible. He looked like a man who had been holding himself together by a single thread for several hours and had not yet gotten the news that he could let go. "She needs to sleep it off. Keep fluids available when she wakes. Don't let her get up before she's ready." He nodded. His hands were on his knees, gripping. "Elias." She waited until he looked at her. "She's going to be all right." He didn't say anything. He pressed his hand briefly, once, over his eyes in an echo of what she'd done a minute before, and she understood that he was not going to cry in front of her, and she respected that, because she wasn't going to cry in front of him either. They sat with the sleeping girl between them until the light began to come through the curtains. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs just after 6, fully dressed, the way she'd seen him at the barn sometimes, the readiness of a boy who had spent 3 years keeping himself prepared for the next bad thing. "Well?" he said. "She's fine," Clara said from the bottom of the stairs. "Fever broke before 5. She's sleeping." He held the railing at the top of the stairs and was still for a moment. She could see his grip loosen, fingers relaxing, the tension leaving his shoulders in one visible drop. "Go eat something," Clara said, "and you can see her in a while once she's properly rested." He came downstairs. He didn't go to the kitchen right away. He stopped a few feet from Clara and looked at her, and his face had lost its careful neutrality. It was just a 12-year-old boy's face for that moment, open in the way faces are when relief knocks down the structures we build to keep people out. "Thank you," he said. He said it like he meant it and wasn't sure what to do with it. "She's stubborn," Clara said. That helped. Something moved across his face, a fraction of a smile, almost there and then gone, but real. He went past her to the kitchen. She stood in the front hallway for a moment by herself. The house around her was quiet in the specific way of a house where the crisis has passed but not yet fully settled, that still, humming quiet that follows something that could have gone worse. The fire needed tending, the basins needed emptying, Rose needed watching throughout the day. Elias needed sleep even if he refused it. Caleb needed food and the particular comfort of being given something to do. None of these things were going to happen by themselves. Clara went to the stove and started the fire. Her eyes were dry and gritty from the all-night vigil. Her back ached. The knuckles on her right hand were chapped from repeated contact with cold water. She was hungry in the way you are when you've forgotten to eat for 18 hours. A hollow, insistent hunger that hadn't been urgent enough to interrupt the work. She put water on, found the last of the oatmeal, found the brown sugar without needing to look, because she knew this kitchen now, knew where everything lived, knew which shelf had shifted and caused the salt jar to migrate 2 inches to the left, knew that the second drawer stuck in damp weather and had to be lifted slightly to open. She moved through it the way she moved through her own hands, without having to think about the mechanics. She made the oatmeal, set the pot on the table, called for Caleb, who was already in the kitchen and had been watching her work without commenting, which was its own kind of shift in their relationship. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway just as she was serving. "Sit down," she said, without looking at him. "You look like you might fall over." "I'm fine," he said, which was obviously untrue. "Sit down anyway." He sat. She set a bowl in front of him. He looked at the oatmeal, and she saw the brown sugar already in it, and he picked up his spoon without argument, which meant he was more exhausted than she'd realized. "I called for the doctor before I came in," he said between spoonfuls. "Sent Caleb with a note." "Good. He'll want to check her over, even if the fever's broken." "Agreed. I want another set of eyes on her." He ate. She sat across from him and ate her own bowl, and the kitchen was quiet except for the stove ticking and Caleb's boots on the back porch where he'd gone to bring in more wood. Outside, the prairie was just becoming visible in the early gray light, the grass silver with frost. "You haven't slept," Elias said. "Neither have you." "I'm used to it." "So am I." He looked at her. She was looking at her oatmeal. There was a quality to his looking that was different from the careful, evaluating look he'd first turned on her in the street of Red Hollow, or the measured looks across the dinner table during the first weeks of the marriage. This was simpler than that. It was the way a man looks at someone he stopped having to calculate and started simply seeing. She was aware of it, but she didn't comment on it. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He took a moment, the way he always took a moment when he was searching for words that didn't come naturally to him. "What you did last night, the whole night, I couldn't have done that." "Yes, you could." "No." He said it with the flatness of someone correcting a factual error. "I would have panicked. I would have ridden for the doctor in the middle of the night and left the children here alone, or I would have sat there frozen while she burned up." He set his spoon down. "I've done it before. When Martha—" He stopped. "You don't have to say it. When she got sick, the first time she went high with fever, I froze. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there." He was looking at the table now, the bowl in front of him. Margaret Harlan came in time. That time. Clara was quiet. "I'm not—" He pushed the bowl slightly away. "I'm not good with things I can't fix with my hands. A fence post I can fix. A sick child in the night. I don't know how to be useful." "You were useful last night. You told me what to do." "That's not useful. That's just a different kind of useful." She paused. "Someone needs to know what to do. Someone else needs to be able to follow instructions without arguing. Both things matter." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know I didn't. When we started this, I know it wasn't what you would have chosen if you'd had other options." She held his gaze. "You didn't have other options either. That's not the same situation." "Isn't it?" A longer pause. Outside, Caleb dropped the wood he'd been carrying and swore, a brief, muffled expletive that they both heard and both chose not to react to. "It's not the same," Elias said again, but less certainly. "Maybe not," Clara said, "but it doesn't matter anymore. I'm here. That's the fact that counts now." He was still looking at her with that new, simpler quality of attention. She thought about saying something else, something that might acknowledge what had shifted between them over the course of the long night, some acknowledgement that the distance had closed, not entirely, not dramatically, but measurably. But she didn't have those words yet, and she suspected he didn't either, and forcing them would ruin whatever they were building here with something premature. She stood up and collected the bowls. "You should sleep," she said. "A few hours at least. I'll watch Rose. I'll sit with her while she sleeps. I won't sleep, but I'll be there when she wakes." She considered arguing and decided against it. A man who wanted to sit with his recovering daughter was not a battle she needed to fight. "All right," she said, "call me if anything changes." He nodded. He stood up, and for a moment they were very close in the small kitchen space. An ordinary proximity, the kind you can't avoid when two people share a house and a stove and a table. And she could see the exhaustion on his face, and the thing underneath it that wasn't quite exhaustion, the thing that was still learning to be something other than grief. He moved past her toward the front room. She stood at the basin and washed the bowls. The doctor came that afternoon and confirmed what Clara had already concluded. The fever had broken cleanly, the child's lungs were clear, her throat was inflamed but not dangerously so, and she needed rest and fluids and several days off her feet. He gave no particular credit for the night's work to anyone, because he was a practical man who had his own hard night behind him and more coming, but he said, on his way out, to Elias, "Your wife knows what she's doing." Elias said, "Yes, she does." Clara was at the stove when he said it and didn't turn around, but she heard every word. Rose recovered over the course of 4 days, moving from the settee to a chair to the kitchen table in stages, each stage marked by an increase in questions and a decrease in patience with being made to rest. By the second day, she was demanding her drawing paper. By the third, she was arguing with Clara about whether she was well enough to go outside. By the fourth, she was at the kitchen table drawing something very involved with a stub of charcoal while Clara made bread beside her. And the household had resumed the rhythm it had found over the past 2 months, if slightly altered. Altered in ways Clara was still measuring. Caleb, for one. He had sat with Rose briefly on the second day of recovery, perched awkwardly on the edge of the settee, trying to look casual about the fact that he was clearly relieved. He'd brought her a carved wooden horse that he'd been working on in the barn. Clara had seen the shavings, had wondered what he was making, and set it on the table beside the settee without explanation. And Rose had said, "You made this for me," not as a question, and he'd said, "It was going to be a fence post, but it turned out wrong." And Rose had laughed, and Caleb had looked at the floorboards, but there was something almost soft in the line of his shoulders. That evening, he found Clara in the kitchen and said without preamble, "Can you teach me what you did? The fever thing." She looked at him. The cool cloth method, or the willow bark tea, or how to assess whether a fever needs a doctor? "All of it," he said. "I want to know." She taught him over the following days, piece by piece, working it into conversation the way you work salt into bread. Not as a lesson, but as something that comes up naturally. He was a quick learner. He remembered things the first time she said them, and asked precise, practical questions, the kind that told her he was already applying the information in his head. What he didn't do was talk about what had happened between them in any direct way. He was still 12, still guarded, still working at his own speed through whatever revision he was making of the world. But there was no more deliberateness in his silences, no more careful management of distance. He came to the kitchen in the evenings now, and sat there while she worked, sometimes reading, sometimes helping, sometimes just there. And she let him be just there, because that was enough. The shift with Elias was harder to describe. It didn't have a clear shape yet. They were not close in the way that she'd once imagined closeness might look. The romantic shorthand of two people drawn to each other by feeling and proximity and the particular alchemy of compatibility. What they had was something less convenient and more real. They had worked a hard night together and survived it. They had sat on opposite sides of a feverish child and done what needed doing without asking each other for more than the other could give. They had both been honest, in the kitchen the morning after, in the way that exhausted people sometimes are. Without the social lubrication of tact, saying true things because the energy for anything else was gone. He stopped appearing in the doorway and then disappearing. He started staying, coming in from the field in the evenings and sitting at the table with coffee while she finished the dishes, not doing anything in particular, not saying much, just present. She understood that for him, this was not a small thing. One evening near the end of October, when Rose was fully recovered and the household had settled back into its rhythm, Elias came in from the barn and found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, writing a letter. He looked at it, but didn't comment. "My sister," Clara said, without looking up. "You have a sister." "In Chicago. We don't write often." She paused. "I'm telling her I'm here, that I've stayed. She'll probably think it's strange. Is she the kind of person who does what she says she will?" Clara thought about Adeline's 2 short letters in 3 years. I do hope you'll visit when things settle down. No, she said. Not really. He sat down across from her. Outside the window, the last of the October light was going. That particular October sunset that was different from every other, sharper and colder and somehow more final, the sky drawing itself in before winter. What do you want from her? He asked. It was a direct question, the kind he occasionally asked when he wasn't trying to be careful. She appreciated them because they were rare and because he meant them. I don't know, she said honestly. To tell someone. She put down the pen. I don't have many people I can tell things to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You can tell me things. She looked at him. He looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, in the slightly uncomfortable way of a man who had just said something true and wasn't sure how it was going to land. I know, she said. He didn't say anything else. She picked up the pen and finished the letter. He sat across the table and drank his coffee, and the kitchen was warm, and the night came down outside. And somewhere upstairs Rose was already asleep under the patchwork quilt, and Caleb was reading by lamplight. And the house that had not known Clara Bennett 6 weeks ago held her now with a quietness that was almost beginning to feel like belonging. She sealed the letter, set it by the door to go to town. The fact of what she had become in this house, what she was still, slowly, becoming, did not announce itself with any particular ceremony. It was there in the worn, smooth path between the stove and the table, worn partly by her own feet now. It was there in the children's voices calling her name without hesitation. It was there in the pair of leather gloves on the hook by the back door, placed there by a man who didn't say much but noticed things. She turned down the lamp, went upstairs. Through Rose's door she could hear the slow, steady breathing of a child who had been sick and was well again, sleeping without fear in a house where someone would come if she called. Clara stood in the hallway and listened to it for a moment. Then she went to bed. November arrived without ceremony, the way November does. Not with the dramatic entrance of the first frost or the slow golden retreat of October, but with a simple gray settling in, as if the sky had decided to lower itself a few feet and stay there. The days shortened until the darkness at both ends of them pressed against the working hours, and the cold that had been polite in October became earnest and permanent. The ranch turned inward on itself, the way all living things do in that season, pulling resources toward the center and waiting. Clara had been at Mercer Ridge for 3 months. She didn't mark it with any particular reflection. She was not, by nature, a woman who paused to take stock when there was still work to be done. But the 3-month mark arrived in her consciousness one morning while she was at the kitchen window watching the first light come up over the frost-covered grass, and she registered it the way you register the fact that you've been breathing in a new place long enough that it no longer smells foreign. The house was familiar now, not hers in the way it had once been Martha's. She was careful about that distinction, still, but familiar in the way a well-used tool is familiar, known by the hand, trusted. She knew where the floor gave under weight and where it didn't. She knew the particular sound the back door made when the wind was from the north. She knew that the cellar stayed 2 degrees warmer than anywhere else on the property, and that this made it the best place to keep the root vegetables through January, and she had organized it accordingly. The children were different too. Not transformed. She wasn't romantic enough to imagine 2 months of proximity had undone years of complicated grief, but changed in the specific ways that children change when they start to feel safe again. Rose had stopped testing the edges. In the early weeks, she'd been watchful in a way that Clara had recognized as the behavior of a child who had lost something large and was waiting to find out what else was going to disappear. Helpful and sweet on the surface, but with a quality of readiness underneath it, a braced quality. That had eased. Not entirely, but enough that Rose now argued with Clara about bedtime and complained about having to eat things she didn't like, which was its own kind of trust. Caleb was harder to read, as he had always been, but the hard reading was getting easier. He'd taken up the medical knowledge she'd offered him with a seriousness that told her it meant more to him than practicality. It was a way of feeling less helpless, she suspected, in a life that had presented him with several situations where helplessness was the only option. He kept a small notebook now where he wrote things down. Symptoms. Remedies. She'd found it once, accidentally, while gathering the mending, and she hadn't read it, but she'd seen the careful handwriting and the meticulous organization. and she'd set it back exactly where it had been. And Elias. She thought about Elias more carefully now, which was itself something she noticed. In the early weeks, she'd thought about him the way you think about a contract. The terms, the obligations, the practical logistics of two people sharing a household that neither of them fully owned. She'd thought about him in terms of what he needed and what she was prepared to provide. It was not unkind thinking, but it was measured. The thinking of a woman who had been burned by hoping for more than was on offer. What she hadn't accounted for was that the man would turn out to be worth thinking about in a different way. Not because he was without flaw. He had plenty of those, and none of the endearing kind that made flaws charming. He was closed off in ways that sometimes felt like walls she'd never get through. He was uncomfortable with anything that smelled like sentiment, which made conversations that mattered to her often feel like conversations he was tolerating. He could go 3 days without saying more than practical necessities, not from coldness, but from a depth of internal preoccupation that had no exits. He still sometimes moved through the house like a man who was waiting for the next loss, and that was not a quality that made living alongside him easy. But he was also the man who had knelt in the dust of Red Hollow to offer her a way out, who had thought to mention the lock on the door, who had watched her learn to set a fence post without making her feel watched, who had sat opposite her through a long, sick night with a basin and a cloth and done exactly what she told him, without question, without ego, because what mattered was Rose. The morning she told him about the money was in the second week of November. She'd been doing the household accounts since September. Elias had handed the ledger to her after she'd reorganized the pantry and mentioned, in passing, that some of the buying patterns weren't efficient. He'd handed it over with the look of a man surrendering something he'd been managing badly and knew it. She'd taken it without comment and started learning the shape of the ranch's finances, which were not as bleak as she'd feared, but not comfortable. The problem she'd found was slower building. A debt, taken on 3 years ago after Martha died, and the ranch had lost 2 months of productive work, while Elias tried to manage grief and cattle and 2 young children simultaneously. The creditor was a man in town named Ferris Aldrin, the husband of the shopkeeper's wife, which explained Mrs. Aldrin's particular brand of careful friendliness. The terms of the debt were not unusual, but the interest had been accumulating quietly while Elias focused on everything else, and the total was now at a figure that was going to matter come spring when he needed to buy feed. She showed him the ledger at the kitchen table after dinner when the children were upstairs. She walked him through the numbers plainly, without editorial. This is what you owe. This is how the interest has grown. This is where we'll be by spring if nothing changes. He looked at it for a long time. I knew about the debt, he said. I assumed you did. I'm not sure you knew about the interest. He turned the ledger slightly, reading the column she'd added on the right side where she'd projected the growth. His jaw tightened. No. Aldrin has been adding it quarterly. He didn't mention that. I imagine not. He pushed back slightly from the table. Not in anger, in the way a man does when he needs a few inches of space to think. What do we do about it? She had already thought about this, obviously, because that was how she operated. She didn't bring a problem without having spent time on the solution. We can renegotiate the terms. I can write the letter if you'd prefer, or you can go in person. Face-to-face is usually better with men like Aldrin. It makes it harder for them to say no to your face than on paper. She paused. We could also look at what the ranch can sell this winter. The 3 steers that aren't pulling weight. Tom Dempsey mentioned he was looking to buy last month. Dempsey offered low. He offered low because he thought you weren't paying attention. We can counter. Elias looked at her. There was that quality of attention again, the one she'd started to recognize. The look that meant he was seeing her, not just the situation. You've thought about this for a while, he said, since October. You could have mentioned it earlier. I wanted to understand it fully first. I don't like bringing half problems. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, write the letter to Aldrin. I'll review it before it goes. All right. And I'll talk to Dempsey about the steers. If he offers below 60 for the 3 of them, walk away. He'll come back. Elias looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to read, the one that sat between exasperation and something warmer. You've already done that math too. It's not complicated math. It is when you're doing it in your head while making bread. She almost smiled. The bread doesn't require that much attention. He almost smiled back. It was almost enough. The letter to Aldrin produced a meeting, and the meeting produced a renegotiated repayment schedule with a fixed interest rate. And the conversation with Dempsey produced $64 for 3 steers, which was $4 more than she'd calculated, and which Elias reported at dinner with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been told something would work and has watched it work. 64, Caleb said. That's good, right? That's good, Elias said. Clara said 60, Rose announced, because Rose kept track of everything that was said at the kitchen table and treated it as personal inventory. Clara said at least 60, Clara said. Same thing, Rose said. Caleb looked at Clara across the table. How did you know he'd come up? Because he needed the steers more than he wanted to seem like he needed them. Once your father walked away, the need was going to win over the performance. Caleb considered this. That's useful to know. It is. People tell you what they need by how hard they try not to show it. He wrote that down in his notebook. She saw him do it later from across the room, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Something in the vicinity of pride, but quieter and more private than pride usually was. The visit from Thomas Avery happened on a Saturday in late November, which was the last thing Clara had expected, and which arrived in her life the way unwanted things tend to, without warning, while she was doing something ordinary. She was in the garden. The garden itself was done for the season. She'd put it to bed properly in October, turned the soil, laid the compost in. But she was out there anyway, planning next year's layout in her head, walking the rows and thinking about what should go where. The cold was sharp, but not brutal, the kind she'd gotten used to, and she'd been outside for 20 minutes already, absorbed in the calculation of what could grow alongside what. She heard the wagon before she saw it, looked up, and there was a rig coming up the ranch road. A decent rig, not a work wagon, with a single horse and a driver she didn't recognize at this distance. She watched it for a moment, then went to the fence gate and waited. The driver pulled up and she saw who it was, and for a moment she didn't believe it. Thomas Avery. In his clean shirt and his wire-rimmed spectacles, which sat at the same crooked angle she remembered from that afternoon in August. He looked somewhat older than she remembered, or perhaps she simply saw him differently now, the thinness more pronounced, the apologetic quality of his face more visible. He pulled the horse to a stop and looked down at her from the wagon seat, and she saw the moment he registered that she was not what he'd expected to find, not the stranded, desperate woman from the main street of Red Hollow, but a woman standing at the gate of a working ranch in the November cold with mud on her boots and steady eyes. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. He flinched slightly. "Of course. I apologize." He climbed down from the wagon, holding his hat, which was what men did when they were about to say something they were uncomfortable saying. "I was passing through from Enid, and I heard you'd settled at the Mercer place." "You heard correctly. I wanted to—" He turned his hat over. "I felt I owed you an apology for how I behaved that afternoon. What I said was—" He stopped. "It was unkind, and it wasn't warranted." Clara looked at him. He was sincere. She could see that. The apology was genuine, the discomfort real, the hat turning not performance, but the actual physical expression of embarrassment that had been sitting with him for 3 months. "You were honest," she said. "I was cruel." "You were both, but the honesty was more useful than the kindness would have been." He blinked behind the wire frames. "I don't follow. If you'd been polite about it, if you'd said perhaps or maybe and let me hope for something that wasn't going to happen, I'd have spent time I didn't have on a possibility that didn't exist." She met his eyes calmly. "Your bluntness meant I had to find another solution quickly. I found one." He looked at the ranch behind her, the house, solid on its rise, the barn, the fences, the clean practicality of a working property. "You did," he said, and there was something in his voice she chose not to examine too closely, some combination of things that she suspected included regret. "Was there something else you needed?" she asked. "No, I only—" He put his hat back on, which meant the uncomfortable part was over. "I wanted you to know I thought better of it afterward." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "I mean that sincerely." He nodded. Climbed back into his wagon with the stiff movements of a man who hadn't planned how he was going to leave this conversation. He took up the reins. "I hope you're well, Mrs. Mercer." "I am, Thank you for stopping." He turned the wagon around and drove back down the road. She watched him go, and she noticed something as she watched. There was nothing in her chest. No leftover wound from that afternoon in August. No residual bitterness, which was what she might have expected. The specific bitterness of a woman who had been publicly humiliated by a man who was now standing in her gateway, apologizing. It wasn't that she'd forgotten. She hadn't. But the August afternoon had been a long time ago, in a life that felt like it belonged to a slightly different version of her, someone who had been standing at the edge of things. She was not at the edge now. She went back to her garden and went on thinking about the spring planting. She told Elias that evening, not in a dramatic way, just mentioned it while they were both at the table after dinner, the way she'd mention any piece of news that involved the ranch or its people. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What did you tell him?" That his honesty had been useful. A pause. "Did you mean that?" "Yes." She was sorting seeds at the table, the small packets she'd saved from the garden, squash, beans, the carrots she wanted to try again in the spring. If he'd handled it gently, I'd have had less reason to say yes to you quickly. Elias was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding something. "Do you wish you'd had more time?" he said. "To decide." She looked up from the seeds. He was watching her with the direct quality she'd come to associate with his honest questions, the ones he only asked when he'd been sitting with them long enough that not asking was worse. "No," she said. "More time wouldn't have told me anything useful. I didn't know you. I made a decision based on what I could assess quickly, and it turned out to be—" She paused, sorting a small pile of bean seeds. "It turned out to be a reasonable decision." "A reasonable decision," he said, and something in his voice made her look up again. He was looking at her with an expression that was not his usual measured watching. It was something more open than that, something that had been building toward openness for long enough that it was finally arriving. She had seen it occasionally over the past weeks, at the kitchen table after the fever night, in the field when she'd done the fence work, in small moments that accumulated without announcement. But this was clearer than any of those. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He looked at the table between them, the seeds, the ledger she'd left open, the ordinary surface of an ordinary evening. Then he looked at her. "I haven't said—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at saying things." "I know." "I know you know." A brief pause. "I want to say them anyway." She set down the seeds. "When I came across the street that afternoon in Red Hollow," he said, "I told you I needed help with the children and the ranch. And that was true." He kept his eyes on hers, which she could tell cost him something. "But that wasn't all of it. I'd been watching you for an hour. I watched Avery and then Pruitt and—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "I watched you stay upright through all of it, on that bench, in that heat, with your trunk in the dirt and nowhere to go. You didn't cry. You didn't argue with them. You just kept deciding what to do next." Clara said nothing. "That's not a quality a man finds because he went looking for a housekeeper," he said. "That's a quality you notice in a person because you recognize it." She understood what he meant. She understood it the way she understood the things Caleb said without saying them. In the negative space around the words, he was telling her he'd been lonely, not in the simple way of a man without a wife, but in the deeper way of a man who carried something inside himself that didn't have a place to go, and who had recognized across a dusty street someone else carrying the same thing. "I know," she said quietly. "I recognized it too." He reached across this table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand placed near the seeds, palm up, available. The same hand she'd held getting down from the wagon that first night, calloused, scarred in places, the hand of a man who used it for everything. She put hers in it. They sat like that for a moment, neither of them saying anything because what needed to be said had been said and everything else could wait. The knock on the door came 3 days later on a Tuesday afternoon, and it changed the temperature of the house immediately. Clara was in the kitchen when Caleb came in from outside and said, in the tone of someone delivering news he wasn't sure how to characterize, "There's a man at the gate. Says he knows you." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Who?" "Didn't give a name. Has a fancy horse." She went to the door. Standing at the gate was a man she needed only 1 second to recognize, Because some people leave impressions deep enough that a year of distance doesn't blur them. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had always opened doors for him. Handsome in the conventional way. The way that got easier as men aged and filled out. He was holding his horse's reins and looking at the house with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. It was James Whitfield. She'd met him in Decatur before the mill let her go. He'd come through on business, the kind of business that moved through small Illinois cities like water, through fingers, present for a moment and then gone. He'd paid attention to her for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks he had been everything she hadn't known she was susceptible to. Attentive, funny, able to look her in the eye in a way that made her feel seen rather than catalogued. She had not let herself hope for more than she had reason to, but she had let herself enjoy it, which had been its own particular mistake. When he left, he left. No letter, no explanation, just the absence where he'd been, which she'd filled with the understanding that she'd misread the situation, that what she'd taken for something real had been a pleasantness. He extended to everyone he met, and that she'd been foolish to file it under anything else. She walked to the gate. "Clara," he said, and he said her name the way he'd always said it, with a warmth that she now knew was deployed rather than felt. "Mr. Whitfield." He registered the formality and adjusted. "I heard you'd come to Oklahoma Territory. I was passing through Red Hollow last week, and people were, He glanced at the house. "People talked about you. People in Red Hollow usually do. They said you'd married Mercer, the rancher." His eyes moved from the house to her face. "I wanted to see if things were well." "Things are well." He shifted the reins in his hands. He was performing something she could see. Had always been able to see it in him, she realized now, which meant the problem hadn't been that she couldn't read him. The problem had been that she'd wanted not to. "Clara, I've thought about what happened in Decatur. What didn't happen. I handled it poorly." "You disappeared," she said, without a word. "I know. I'm not saying that to reproach you. I'm saying it to be accurate." He met her eyes. To his credit, he didn't flinch. "I was a coward," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "No. You were a man who decided I wasn't worth the effort of honesty." She said it without heat, the way you state a thing that is simply true. "There's a difference. Cowardice implies you were afraid of something. You weren't afraid, you just didn't care enough." He absorbed that. "You're right," he said after a moment. "That's a fair accounting of it. So why are you here?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing that she had, in some private corner of herself, expected him to say, because people like James Whitfield always said it eventually. "I've regretted it. I think what we had could have been, we had 3 weeks of your attention," she said. "That's not a foundation. It could be the beginning of one." She looked at him clearly, at the handsome face and the easy manner and the way he stood at her gate with the quiet assumption that she was still the woman he'd left behind in Illinois, waiting, hoping, ready to renegotiate on whatever terms he was willing to offer. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I have a husband and 2 children and a ranch that needs work before the deep freeze comes. I have a kitchen that smells like bread right now because I made bread this morning, and I'm proud of it. I have a fence line I set with my own hands and a cellar I organized so we don't go short in January." She paused. "I am not in need of what you're offering. I'm not sure I ever was, but I'm certain of it now." He was quiet. Something moved across his face, not quite hurt, but the beginning of understanding that the situation was not what he'd arrived expecting. "You're happy," he said. It came out sounding like he'd found the answer to something. "I'm settled," she said. "That's more durable than happy and harder to achieve." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then he put his hat on and gathered his reins. "You were always the most honest person I knew," he said. "I shouldn't have taken that for granted." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't." He rode. She watched him go down the ranch road until he turned at the bottom and disappeared, and she noticed again the absence of wound. No ache in the sternum, no residue. 3 weeks of attention from a man who hadn't thought her worth the truth had once felt, in the small enclosed world of Decatur, like a significant loss. Measured against 3 months of building something real in the Oklahoma Territory, it was barely a footnote. She went back inside. Caleb was in the kitchen, pretending to be reading. He had not been reading. "Who was that?" he asked, with the elaborately casual tone of a 12-year-old who had been watching from the window. Someone from back home, Clara said. She went to the stove and checked the bread. He came to see how I was. How you were? People do that sometimes, when they've lost track of someone. She turned from the stove. He was satisfied with what he found. He won't be back. Caleb looked at her. He was doing his reading the situation thing, the assessment she'd come to recognize as his particular way of making sense of the world. You weren't upset, he said. It wasn't a question. No. You didn't want him to stay? No. He considered this. Good, he said, with a matter-of-factness that made her want to smile, but she kept it measured, because that was the agreement between them. Not too much, not yet, but building. She told Elias that evening. She told him directly, the way she told him most things, sitting at the table plainly, without performance. She told him who Whitfield was, and what had happened in Decatur, and what he'd said at the gate. She watched Elias's face go through several configurations, none of them comfortable, and she let them happen because they were his to have. You should have called me, he said, when she finished. Why? Because, he stopped. He had no business coming here. He had the same business any person has who goes looking for someone they wronged. He was guilty about it. She paused. I handled it. I know you handled it. That's not... He pushed his coffee cup slightly. I don't like that you had to. I didn't have to, she said. I chose to. He looked at her. It needed saying to him, she said, not for his benefit, for mine. I needed to say it myself. She met his eyes. Do you understand the difference? A long pause. Yes, he said. It's done now. Is it? For me it is. She picked up the coffee cup he'd pushed away and set it back within his reach. I came here to build something. I'm building it. Nothing he said was going to take me back to who I was in August, standing in that street. Elias looked at her with a quality of attention that was, she thought, the clearest she'd seen from him, like he was not filtering anything, not managing anything, just looking. I know who you are, he said. It was a simple sentence, probably the most direct thing he'd ever said to her. She felt it in the way you feel a weight lifting that you'd been carrying so long you'd stop noticing its presence, that specific disorientation of sudden lightness. I know, she said. They sat together in the kitchen until the lamp oil burned low, not talking much, the silence between them having changed its nature entirely from those first careful evenings, no longer the silence of two strangers managing proximity, but the silence of two people who had decided to be in the same room and found that was enough. Rose came downstairs for water at 9 o'clock, as she often did. It was her most reliable method of extending the evening, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw them both there, her father and Clara, sitting across from each other at the table. You're both still up, she said, in the tone of someone noting an unusual but pleasing phenomenon. So are you, Clara said. I was thirsty. Get your water and go back to bed. Rose got her water. She stood at the counter drinking it with the slow deliberateness of a child maximizing legitimate time, looking at them from under her eyelashes with an expression of pointed satisfaction. You look cozy, she said. Rose, Elias said, with the flat parental tone that meant the conversation was over. Rose put down her cup. She came past the table on her way to the stairs, and she stopped beside Clara and pressed a brief, warm kiss against Clara's cheek with the matter-of-fact decisiveness that characterized everything she did, and then padded off to the stairs without another word, as if she'd simply done what needed doing and seen no reason to make a scene of it. Clara sat very still for a moment. The place on her cheek where Rose had kissed her felt warm. Across the table, Elias was looking at her with a softness she had not seen on his face before. A particular softness that had nothing cautious in it, nothing measuring, nothing held back. She means it, he said quietly, when she does things like that. I know, Clara said. The lamp flickered. The November dark pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside, a wind was coming up, moving through the grass with the low whisper of a season announcing itself. The long winter settling in over Mercer Ridge, over the fences Clara had helped build, and the cellar she'd organized, and the kitchen that smelled like her bread. She was not the woman they'd laughed at in Red Hollow. She was not the woman Thomas Avery had looked away from, or the punchline of Harold Pruitt's joke. She was not even the desperate, stranded woman who had sat on a trunk in the August dust and watched three men walk away. She was the woman who had stayed, who had worked and watched and waited, not for rescue, but for the slower, less dramatic thing. The accumulation of a life, piece by piece, built from what was real instead of what she'd once imagined real should look like. It was not perfect. There were still mornings when the loneliness hit sideways, the specific loneliness of being a person who had come to this life from outside it and still sometimes moved through it aware of the seams. There were still days when Caleb pulled back into himself and she didn't know how to reach him. There were still evenings when Elias went somewhere inside himself she couldn't follow. But the house held her now without qualification. The children knew her voice. The man across the table knew who she was. She turned down the lamp when it began to sputter. The kitchen went dark and she and Elias walked to the stairs together, and the boards creaked under their weight. Two people's weight now, as it had been for 3 months. The house having finally learned the sound of her step and incorporated it into its own. Winter came down hard on the Oklahoma Territory that year, harder than the old-timers in Red Hollow said they'd seen in a decade. The snow arrived in December with a seriousness that made the November cold seem like a preliminary suggestion, and it stayed. Not the polite dusting that melted by afternoon, but the deep-packed kind that settled into the land and changed its geography, filling the fence lines and leveling the familiar shapes of the prairie into a single white expanse that had no edges. Mercer Ridge held. The cellar Clara had organized in October proved its worth 3 times over. The root vegetables she'd put up, the preserves she'd been working since August, the dried beans and the cured pork, and the careful rationing she'd built into her weekly planning. All of it became the architecture that kept 4 people fed through 6 weeks of weather that made the road to town impassable for days at a stretch. She wasn't smug about it. It was simply what she'd done, and it was working, and that was the only measurement she applied. The days during the deep freeze were long and close, in the way that only winter days on a frontier ranch can be, the 4 of them pressed into the warmth of the house, the outdoors reduced to whatever could be managed in short, purposeful bursts before the cold drove you back in. Elias and Caleb handled the cattle together every morning, coming back with frost on their collars and the efficient silence of people who have found a working rhythm. Clara and Rose managed the house, which during a hard winter expanded into something closer to a small production operation. Bread, preserves, mending, the ongoing management of supplies against consumption, the small repairs that accumulated whenever the weather kept you indoors long enough to notice them. It was during this stretch, in the enforced proximity of a hard January, that the family finished becoming one, not in any moment that announced itself. That was what Clara would later understand, that the significant transformations in a household don't arrive with ceremony. They happen in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the 10,000 small choices to stay and keep trying, in the way habits form between people without anyone deciding to form them. She noticed it first in the way Caleb moved through the house differently than he had in September. Not the careful navigation of a guest in unfamiliar territory, but the unconscious ease of someone who knew where everything was and trusted that it would still be there tomorrow. She noticed it in the way Rose had stopped watching her with that undercurrent of readiness, that braced quality. She noticed it in the evenings, when the 4 of them were together in the front room with the fire going and the wind working at the windows, Elias reading or doing accounts, Caleb in his notebook, Rose drawing, Clara mending or planning the spring garden. And the silence between them was not managed or careful, but simply the quiet of people who did not need to fill the space between themselves with noise in order to feel safe. One evening in January, Caleb looked up from his notebook and said, without preamble, "I want to be a doctor." The room was quiet for a moment. "All right," Clara said. He looked at her. Apparently he had expected something more complicated than that. "You don't think it's expensive. School, and then..." "It's expensive," Clara agreed. "It's also several years from now, and a lot can change, but the wanting is the part that matters first." She set down her mending. "What made you decide?" He thought about it, the way he thought about things, genuinely, without performance. "When Rose was sick," he said, "I kept thinking, if I'd known more, I could have done more. I didn't want to feel that again." Across the room, Elias had looked up from his accounts. He was watching Caleb with an expression Clara had come to recognize as the specific look of a father hearing his son say something that surprises him by being exactly right. "That's a reasonable thing not to want to feel," Clara said, "and it's a reasonable reason." "It's a long way from here to medical school," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said. "Most good things are." He looked at her for a moment, and then he went back to his notebook, and she picked up her mending, and the conversation was finished. But it stayed in the room afterward, the way that conversations do when something true has been said in them, a residual warmth that didn't dissipate. After the children were in bed, Elias came and stood at the kitchen doorway while Clara was putting out the lamp. "He's never said that before," he said, "about what he wants. He probably hasn't known before." Could he actually do it? The school, the training? Clara turned to look at him. "He's the most focused 12-year-old I've ever encountered. He learns things the first time they're told to him and writes them down so he doesn't forget. He is relentlessly practical, and he cares about getting things right." She paused. "Yes, he could." Elias leaned against the door frame. In the dim light, he looked less tired than he had in September. Not young, not easy, but less like a man who was simply enduring. "You'd know better than me," he said. "You'd know too if you watched him the way I do. I watch him. You watch him while you're also watching the fence line and the cattle and the accounts and the weather." She wasn't saying it as a criticism, just as a fact. "I watch him because that's part of what I'm here to do." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't tell you that was part of what I needed. When I asked you. You didn't have to." He looked at her in the dim kitchen. "Clara," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, the 2 syllables of her name carrying more than 2 syllables usually could. "What I told you in November, that I know who you are. I remember. I want you to know." He stopped, started again, the way he had to start things that didn't come naturally. "It took me a long time to stop being afraid of knowing someone well enough to lose them." She waited. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," he said. "With you." It was not the most eloquent declaration that had ever been made in a farmhouse kitchen in the Oklahoma Territory. It didn't need to be. Clara understood it completely, understood what it cost a man who moved through the world with his feelings pressed down into some deep interior chamber, what it took to open that chamber far enough to say something true about it. "I know," she said. "I can tell." "That's all?" "That's everything," she said. He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, which was neither the first time nor practiced, and it was imperfect in the specific way that honest things are imperfect. Not graceful, not like the romances she'd read as a girl, but real, which was better. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and fast at once, and thought, "Here." Just that word. Here. The spring that followed the hard winter was the best season Clara had known at Mercer Ridge. Not because it was easy. It wasn't. The deep freeze had done damage that needed addressing. A section of the east fence that hadn't survived the weight of ice and snow, a section of the barn roof that needed replacing before the spring rains arrived, 2 of the cattle that had come through the winter thin and needed building back up. There was the garden to turn and plant, which she did systematically over 3 weeks in April, putting in the things she'd thought about all winter, giving each crop the space and position she'd calculated during those frozen days when planning was the only forward motion available. What made it the best season was a quality of things she hadn't experienced before, the sense of working towards something she had a stake in. Not working to survive, not working to prove, not working to earn the right to exist in a space that had other people's prior claims on it. Working because this was hers. The garden was hers. The fence line was hers. The children who called her in for meals were hers in the way that mattered, which was not biological but chosen, which she had come to believe was the more durable kind. The letter from Adeline arrived in April, 8 months after Clara had sent hers. Adeline had never been a prompt correspondent. It was longer than her usual letters. 3 pages, which was unprecedented. She wrote that she'd shown Clara's letter to her husband, who had read it twice, which Adeline seemed to find significant. She wrote that she'd told her neighbors about her sister in Oklahoma Territory, who had married a rancher and helped nurse a sick child through the night, and set fence posts and renegotiated debts, and planted a winter garden. She wrote that she was proud, which was something she had not written before, and the uncharacteristic openness of it told Clara that Adeline had been sitting with the letter for a while before she decided to send it. At the end, almost as an afterthought, she wrote, "I think I always assumed you would give up on things, Clara. I don't know where I got that idea. I can see now that I had you confused with someone else, perhaps with the version of you that I told myself about, so I didn't have to feel guilty about how little I kept in touch. I'm sorry for that. I'd like to come out to visit, if you'd have me. I want to see this place you've built." Clara read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and set it beside her coffee cup and sat with it for a while. Rose came in from outside with muddy hands and said, "What's that?" "A letter from my sister." Rose climbed onto the chair beside her and looked at the folded paper with the proprietary curiosity she applied to most things. "What does it say?" "That she wants to visit." "Is she nice?" Clara thought about Adeline, her careful politeness, her short letters, the way she had managed her distance with such practiced ease that Clara had spent years taking it personally before she understood it was more about Adeline than about her. "She's trying to be," she said. "That's something." "Better than not trying," Rose said, with the practical philosophy that she applied to most situations, and climbed back down and went to the basin to wash her hands. She wrote back to Adeline. She said, "Come in September when the summer work is done and the harvest is in. I'll have time to show you around properly. Bring enough clothes for 2 weeks. The road from Red Hollow is rough but passable. You'll manage." She did not write, "I missed you," though she had. She did not write, "I forgive you for leaving me out there alone." That was too large a sentence for a letter, and some things were better said face to face. What she wrote instead was the simple, practical fact of an invitation, because that was what she could offer, and it was enough to start with. Mrs. Harlan came to Sunday dinner in April and stayed long enough to say things that Clara stored and thought about afterward. Margaret Harlan had been, Clara had come to understand, the person who had held the pieces of this family together during the 3 years between Martha's death and Clara's arrival. Not dramatically, not with any fuss, but with the steady, unglamorous consistency of a woman who understood that presence was more useful than sentiment. She had cooked for them. She had watched the children. She had sat with Elias in the evenings when the grief was too large for him to carry alone, and had not tried to fix it, which was the most useful thing she could have done. She and Clara had developed a friendship that was quiet and particular, built on mutual recognition rather than warmth, which was its own kind of warmth. Margaret did not gush. She said what she meant and left space for other people to do the same. At the end of dinner, when Elias and Caleb had gone to check the new calf that had arrived that week, and Rose was drawing at the other end of the table, Margaret looked at Clara across the dishes and said, "You've done well here." "We've done well?" Clara said. "That's the polite version." Margaret's eyes were direct and uncompromising. "I mean specifically you. Elias is a good man, but he was disappearing. I watched it happen. He was getting smaller every year, not in any visible way, but the way a fire gets smaller when it's running out of fuel. The children were getting smaller, too." She paused. "You stopped that." Clara looked at the table. "I'm not sure one person can stop that in another person." "You'd be surprised." Margaret picked up her coffee cup. "You didn't rescue them. I want to say that clearly because I've seen women who came into grieving households thinking that was the job, and it never works. You didn't rescue them. You just showed up and kept showing up, and eventually they had no choice but to do the same." Clara thought about that for a while after Margaret left. She thought about it that evening, at the kitchen window, looking out at the spring prairie, the grass coming back green now after the hard winter, the sky higher and bluer than it had been in months. You just showed up and kept showing up. It was the most undramatic description of what she'd done, and it was also the most accurate. She hadn't arrived with a plan to transform anyone. She'd arrived with 37 cents and a travel-stained dress and nowhere else to go. And she'd made herself useful, and then she'd made herself necessary, and then she'd made herself home, and the distinction between those 3 stages was important. The first was survival. The second was competence. The third was something else entirely. Something that happened slowly and couldn't be forced, that required the particular patience of a person who has decided that where they are is where they intend to be. She had always been told, in the explicit and implicit languages of her whole life, that she should want less. That the appropriate posture for a woman of her size and circumstances and ordinariness was gratitude for whatever came her way, and restraint about hoping for more. The women who looked at her and calculated what she could and couldn't expect. The men who looked at her body and decided the calculation was complete. The small, careful life she'd been living in Decatur, the mill job, the rented room, the sisters' polite distance, all of it built on the foundation of that assumption, that she was someone who should be grateful for the margins. She was not in the margins now. That was the thing that had changed, and she didn't know exactly when it had changed. Whether it was in the winter, sitting across from Elias in the lamplight with her hand in his, or earlier in October, watching Rose's fever break, or earlier still, in September, following Elias's wagon out of Red Hollow with the stars coming out over the prairie. Maybe it had been changing the whole time, every day that she'd stayed and worked and made herself present in this household, a little more of the old assumption being worn away. Until one morning, she looked up and it was simply gone. She was not grateful for what she'd been given. She was glad of what she'd built. The distinction mattered. She wanted to say that somewhere, to write it down for someone who needed to hear it, because she suspected she was not the only woman in the territory or anywhere else who had been trained into the posture of gratitude for margins. She thought about writing it in a letter, and then she decided she would write it in several. She started that evening at the kitchen table after the household was quiet. She wrote to a woman named Ruth Adler in Nebraska whose listing she'd seen in the Gazette, the kind of listing that sounded familiar because she'd written one like it. The careful description of practical skills, the willing disposition, the absence of any claim to beauty or wealth. She wrote plainly, the way she'd learned to write things that mattered. Dear Miss Adler, I don't know you, but I know the kind of woman who places a listing like yours because I was that woman 8 months ago. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me before I got on that stagecoach. She wrote 3 pages. She told Ruth Adler about Red Hollow and the 3 men and the dusty street, and about Elias and the fence posts and the long, sick night and the winter. She didn't dress it up. She didn't perform strength or pretend the hard parts hadn't been hard, but she wrote honestly about what she'd found on the other side of them, and what she'd learned about the difference between being chosen and choosing, and why that difference was the whole thing. She folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it, and set it with the letters going to town. She wrote 3 more over the following month, to women whose listings appeared in subsequent issues of the Gazette. Each one different, because the details of each situation were different, but each one carrying the same essential truth, the one she'd earned the hard way, that the world was full of people who would look at a woman and tell her what she was worth based on what they could see from where they stood. And that the urgent, necessary work was not convincing those people that they were wrong, but building a life solid enough that their opinion of it stopped mattering. Some of the women wrote back. Ruth Adler wrote a long letter that arrived in June, full of questions and the particular careful hopefulness of a woman who was paying attention. Clara wrote back. The correspondence continued through the summer, and by September she had 4 regular correspondents, women scattered across the territory and beyond, none of them the same, but all of them navigating versions of the same fundamental problem: how to exist as a woman in a world that had very specific and limiting ideas about what a woman like them was worth. She didn't give advice exactly. She gave accounts. Here's what happened. Here's what I did. Here's what I learned from doing it. Decide for yourself what's useful. Adeline came in September as planned. She arrived on the stagecoach from Red Hollow. Clara had sent Elias with the wagon, and was standing in the yard when Clara came out of the house. And for a moment they just looked at each other, the way sisters do after a long time apart, when neither of them is quite sure who the other has become. Adeline was thinner than Clara remembered. She had their mother's mouth and a quality of contained energy that Clara had always found exhausting to be around, though she was trying to see it differently now. Contained energy was its own kind of survival mechanism. She was looking at the house and the garden and the fence line and the barn with an expression that Clara couldn't fully read. "It's real," Adeline said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." She looked at Clara. Her eyes were wet, which was unexpected, because Adeline had always managed her feelings at arm's length. "Something smaller, I think. Something—" She shook her head. "You look different." "I'm the same." "You're not." She said it without criticism. "You're the same, but you're more of it." Clara considered this. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. They talked for 4 hours that first afternoon, while the children were out and Elias was on the land. The way sisters talk when the distance has been long enough that the small things have cleared away and only the large things are left. Adeline talked about her marriage and the parts of it that were good and the parts that weren't. Clara talked about the winter and the fever and the fence line and the letter from James Whitfield. They didn't perform closeness they hadn't earned, but they found the beginning of something more honest than what they'd had before, which was all that could be expected. At one point, Adeline said, "Did you know you were going to stay when you first got here?" "No," Clara said. "I knew I had nowhere else to go. That's different." "When did you know you wanted to stay?" Clara thought about it. About the morning she'd lit a stranger's stove because Rose had asked if she could make oatmeal. About the fence post going in solid under her hands. About the night of the fever and Elias saying, "I know who you are," across the kitchen table. "Gradually," she said, "and then all at once." Adeline nodded. "I always thought you needed things too much," she said. "Wanting things too much made me nervous." "I know. I was wrong about that." "You were a little wrong," Clara said. "Not entirely." Adeline laughed, a surprised laugh, genuinely amused. Clara hadn't heard that laugh in years. "You haven't gotten gentler," she said. "Did you want me to?" "No," Adeline said. "God, no." Rose came back at 5 o'clock, let herself in through the kitchen door, registered the presence of a stranger with the rapid assessment of a child who has been the youngest person in multiple adult conversations, and announced herself to Adeline with the directness that Clara had come to associate with her. "You're the sister," Rose said. "I am." Adeline looked at her with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "You must be Rose." "Clara told me you took a long time to write back." "Rose," Clara said. "That's fair," Adeline said. "I did." Rose considered this and apparently found it satisfactory, because she went to the pantry for an apple and began eating it at the table, listening to the rest of the conversation with the open attention of someone who had been given no reason to pretend she wasn't listening. Caleb was more careful with Adeline, as he was careful with all new people, but Clara watched him and saw the watchfulness ease over the 2 weeks of the visit. By the end of the first week, he was answering her questions about his medical notebook with something approaching enthusiasm, which for Caleb was the equivalent of most people throwing a celebration. Adeline, to her credit, asked real questions and listened to the real answers. And by the time she left, she and Caleb had a correspondence going about a medical text he'd been trying to find, which she'd promised to locate through a bookshop connection in Chicago. Elias was polite with Adeline in the measured way he was polite with most people he didn't know yet. He didn't warm to her immediately because he didn't warm to anyone immediately, but Clara could see him watching the dynamic between the two sisters, the careful reconstruction of something that had been neglected, with a quality of attention that wasn't neutral. He'd lost his own family to distance and time, and he understood the value of repairing what could be repaired. The last night of Adeline's visit, they all sat on the porch in the September evening, and the sky was doing what it did in that territory at that time of year, burning through the whole register of orange and gold and deep rose before giving way to the purple dusk, the stars appearing one at a time and then all at once. Adeline looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "I see why you stayed," she said finally. "It's not just the sky," Clara said. "I know." She glanced at Elias, at the children, at the house behind them. "I know that." Clara walked Adeline to the stage wagon the next morning. They hugged at the road, clumsier than two sisters who'd been close all their lives would have done it, but with more intention than people who hadn't decided to try. "Will you come to Chicago?" Adeline asked. "Maybe, in a year or two, when the ranch is more settled. I'll hold you to that." "You probably won't," Clara said, but the offer will still stand." Adeline laughed again. She got on the stage. She looked back once from the window, and Clara raised a hand, and then the wagon was moving down the road toward Red Hollow. The fall came in gently, more forgiving than the previous year. The almanac was cautious about the winter, but not alarmed. And Clara organized the cellar anyway with the same thoroughness she'd applied the first time, because a thorough cellar cost nothing, and a poorly stocked one cost everything. She put the garden to bed the third week of October, the same way she'd done it the year before, and stood at the fence, looking at the turned earth with a familiarity that had its own particular satisfaction. 1 year. Just over 1 year since she'd stood in Red Hollow's dusty street with 37 cents and a letter that had turned out to be a lie. She had not arrived here the way people arrived in stories, chosen for beauty or grace or the particular kind of goodness that the world rewarded openly. She had arrived unwanted, publicly, on a day that was designed to be her lowest point. She had been looked at and found lacking by men who made that judgment in the time it took to register her body, and the town had watched and smiled, and the world had offered her the lesson it had been trying to teach her since she was 12 years old, that women like her should adjust their expectations accordingly. She had not adjusted her expectations. She had adjusted her location. The evening she decided to write down what she'd learned, not in a letter to a specific person, but in the way you write something when you want it to exist in a more permanent form, she sat at the kitchen table after the house was quiet and wrote for a long time. She wrote about the difference between being chosen and choosing. She wrote about the particular cruelty of being taught to want less as a strategy for surviving disappointment, and how that teaching was its own kind of theft. She wrote about the value of showing up without illusions, about the ranch that had needed her practical skills more than her sentiment, and how that need had been the opening through which everything real had eventually come. She wrote that survival was a legitimate beginning, and that anyone who told you it wasn't had never been in genuine danger of losing. She wrote about Caleb, who had learned to ask for help by watching someone else give it without making it a performance. She wrote about Rose, who had been brave enough to kiss a stranger's cheek because the stranger had remembered the brown sugar. She wrote about Elias, who had been disappearing by degrees until proximity to someone who was still intact showed him the way back. She did not write that she had saved them. She was careful about that because Margaret Harlan was right. Rescue was not what had happened here. What had happened was more mutual and less romantic and more valuable than rescue. She had stayed, and they had stayed, and the staying had changed all of them. She was still not beautiful in the way that opened doors. She was still not small. She was still a woman who took up more space than a lot of people thought she was entitled to, and she was going to go on taking it because the alternative was a life she'd already tried and found insufficient. Elias came down at 11 and found her at the table. He looked at the paper, at the amount of it, and said, "What are you writing?" "What I've learned," she said. He sat across from her. He had his coffee cup, refilled from the pot on the stove, and he sat with it and didn't ask her to explain. That was one of the things she had come to value most about him, the ability to be present without demanding a performance. After a while, he said, "Are you going to send it somewhere?" "I don't know yet. I might just keep it." "It should go somewhere," he said, "if what you've learned is useful to other people." She looked at him across the table. He was saying it plainly, the way he said things when he'd made up his mind about them. Not because he was performing support, but because he meant it. Because he had watched her over the course of a year and come to a conclusion about the value of what she carried. "Maybe," she said. "I'm not asking to read it," he said. "But if you want someone to, I'll tell you when I'm ready." He nodded. He drank his coffee. The kitchen was quiet around them. The children upstairs, the fire low, the autumn night pressing against the windows with the particular dark of a season that was settling in for a long stay. This was the life. Not the version she'd imagined in Decatur, lying awake in a rented room turning over possibilities like cards in a hand she'd been dealt without choosing. Not the version the women in Red Hollow had imagined for her when they'd watched a large woman from back east drag her trunk down a dusty street. Not even the version she'd constructed in her own mind during those first weeks on the ranch, when she'd been so focused on proving her worth that she'd barely had time to notice she was building something. This, the kitchen and the man across the table and the sleeping children and the winter coming and the work that would be there tomorrow, and the spring after that, and the summer after that, each season arriving with its own demands and its own particular beauty, and her here for all of it. She had been wrong about one thing, she thought, looking back. She'd always believed that the world had a fixed opinion of her, and that the best she could do was manage its effects. She'd spent years carrying that belief like a coat she couldn't take off. The constant low-level adjustment for how she was seen, the management of other people's expectations and her own, the preemptive smallening of herself to avoid the particular pain of being found wanting. What she'd discovered at Mercer Ridge was that fixed opinions only fixed themselves to people who stopped moving. The town of Red Hollow had an opinion of her in August. By December, it had been revised. Not because she'd campaigned for revision, she had done exactly nothing to manage the town's perception of her, because she'd been too busy with everything else, but because she had been visible and consistent, and the sheer accumulated fact of her presence had worn down the fixed opinion the way water wore down stone, without drama and without haste, simply by continuing. Mrs. Aldrin at the general store greeted her by name now. Tom Dempsey's wife Nancy had come to her with a preserving question and a medical one, and the careful watchfulness had relaxed into something closer to genuine respect. Even Ida Bright, beautiful, loud, socially precise Ida Bright, had said at the church social in August, with the directness of a woman who knew the value of a good supplier, "I should have made more of an effort in the beginning. You're better than I expected." Clara had said, "Most people are." And Ida had laughed, the real laugh, the one that wasn't performance, and said, "That's going on the wall in my parlor." The community had not become warm overnight, and it had not become warm entirely. And there were still women in Red Hollow who kept a careful distance from the large woman at Mercer Ridge, who managed accounts and wrote letters, and seemed to think she had opinions worth expressing. Clara did not spend time on them. They were exercising their right to their own adjustment speed, and she trusted the work to do its own persuasion. Elias set his cup down and said, "Come to bed." "In a minute." He stood, and he put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed. The light, certain touch of a man who knew where he stood and wasn't afraid to show it. And then he went upstairs, and she heard his boots on the floorboards and the creak of the hall, and then the house settling into its nighttime quiet. She looked at what she'd written. Several pages, in her practical, clear handwriting, the account of a year. The things she'd learned about survival and stubbornness, and the slow, difficult work of letting yourself be known. She thought about Ruth Adler in Nebraska, and the other women she wrote to, and the ones she hadn't met yet but who were somewhere out there, sitting in their own rented rooms or at their own kitchen tables, doing the arithmetic of their circumstances and wondering if the numbers were ever going to add up to something better. She wanted to say, "They might," not in the way you're imagining, and not on the schedule you'd prefer, and not because the world decides to be fair to you, but they might, if you keep showing up, and if you let what's real be real, instead of what you were told to want. She wanted to say, "The world will tell you what you're worth. You don't have to agree." She folded the pages, set them beside the letters going to town. She'd decide in the morning whether to send them somewhere or keep them, and it would probably take more than one morning, and that was fine. She had learned to work at the speed of things that mattered, which was usually slower than she wanted and faster than she feared. She turned out the lamp. The kitchen went dark. Outside, the prairie lay quiet under the October stars, the same prairie she'd driven across a year ago in the dark, sitting on a wagon seat next to a stranger, not knowing what the house at the top of the rise would make of her or she of it. She went upstairs. She passed Rose's door and heard the slow breathing of a child sleeping without fear. She passed Caleb's door and saw the thin line of lamplight underneath. He was still reading, which she noted and chose not to address, because he was 13 now and entitled to some latitude in the matter of staying up late with a book. She stopped for a moment at the door, her hand almost raised to knock, and then she went on. Some things didn't require comment. The fact that he was reading at midnight, that there was a candle worth reading by, was its own kind of evidence. She went into the room that had been the spare room when she arrived and was now simply hers, theirs. The room with the window that faced west where the sunsets happened and the quilt on the bed that she'd mended twice since the winter. The room where the hook on the back of the door held her dress for tomorrow and the washstand held her things beside his things, the ordinary intermingling of two people's mornings. She got into bed. He was already there. She could feel the warmth of him, the slight shift of the mattress. "The lamp is off," he said. "I know." "Good." Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the way it always did this time of year. A long, low sound, almost like a voice, the prairie speaking its own language to anyone who'd learned to listen. She had learned to listen. That was one of the smaller things she'd gained here, and not the least of them. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and the breathing of the sleeping house, and the weight of the past year settled around her the way sleep settles, gradually, completely, without resistance. She had been the woman they pitied, the woman they laughed at in the street, the woman who came 400 miles on a lie and got turned down 3 times in an afternoon and sat on her trunk in the August dust with nowhere left to go. She was still that woman, and she always would be, because that was where she'd come from, and you didn't get to revise the past, and she had stopped wanting to. That woman had picked herself up and made a decision and gotten into a stranger's wagon and carried her own trunk up to a room with a door that locked and cried the ugly cry, and then washed her face and started the fire in the morning because the children needed breakfast. That woman had worked every day for a year without asking anyone to notice, and built something out of a household that had been quietly falling apart, and stayed when leaving would have been easier, and chosen the people who needed her instead of waiting to be chosen by the people who didn't. She was proud of that woman. She was that woman. Still, here in this bed, in this room, in this house, she had made hers by the only method that ever truly worked, by showing up for it day after day, asking nothing from the world but the chance to keep going. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken this particular year in this particular place with these particular people for her to finally believe it. The wind moved through the grass. The house held. Clara closed her eyes.